I never told my mother-in-law I used to prosecute military crimes. She laughed when I walked into the courtroom completely alone. You should have just signed the papers, Jada, she sneered, leaning over the wooden divider. You do not even have a lawyer. You are finished. I just let the silence hang in the air. That arrogant certainty was exactly what I was counting on. Because 5 minutes later, the judge bypassed her son's expensive attorney, looked directly at me, and smiled. Good morning, Colonel, he said. It is an honor to have you in my courtroom. Vivian dropped her designer purse. My ex-husband stopped breathing. And the white stepsister who helped steal my life savings turned pale. Before I tell you how I dismantled so-called perfect family piece by piece, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like and subscribe button if you have ever had to remind someone exactly who they are dealing with. The downtown Atlanta courthouse felt like a refrigerator. The marble floors were cold, the walls were bare, and the air conditioning hummed with a sterile indifference that matched exactly how I felt inside. I am 35 years old, and I was walking into the fight of my life completely alone. My heels clicked against the polished stone, a steady rhythmic sound that echoed down the long corridor. I did not bring a legal team. I did not bring a support system. I carried nothing but a single black leather briefcase. When I pushed open the heavy wooden double doors to courtroom 4B, the suffocating dynamic of the family I married into hit me immediately. Across the aisle sat Terrence, and I was trying to divorce. He looked immaculate. He was wearing a custom-tailored charcoal suit, a silk tie, and a gold watch that gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights. I recognized that suit. I paid for it. I paid for the watch, too. I was sitting next to his high-priced attorney, a man whose hourly rate was likely funded by the very bank accounts Terrence had drained from me. They were whispering and chuckling, leaning back in their chairs with the relaxed posture of men who believed they had already won. Behind Terrence sat the peanut gallery, arranged like royalty in the spectator benches. His mother Vivian was front and center. Vivian was a woman who weaponized her respectability. She wore her Sunday best on a Tuesday morning, complete with a tailored skirt suit and a string of genuine pearls. She sat with her spine rigid, projecting the image of the flawless matriarch of a prominent, affluent African-American family. To her right sat Chloe, Terrence's white stepsister from his late father's second marriage. Chloe was tapping furiously on her phone, a smug grin plastered across her face. Chloe was Vivian's pet project, the living proof of their inclusive, progressive, and wealthy blended family. She possessed an entitlement that suffocated anyone in her path, and today she was here to watch my destruction as a spectator sport. I walked down the center aisle and took my seat at the empty plaintiff table. I placed my briefcase on the wood surface and folded my hands. I did not look at them, but I could feel their eyes burning into the side of my head. The air in the room was thick with their quiet judgment. For 12 years I had kept my past a secret. I had retired early from the military to seek peace, to leave the battlefield behind and start a quiet civilian life. I had never bragged about my rank. I had never thrown my weight around. I had simply wanted to be a wife, to build a home, and to run my independent risk management consultancy in peace. But that desire for a quiet life had been interpreted as weakness. Then came the rustle of clothing. Vivian leaned over the wooden divider separating the gallery from the trial tables. I could smell her expensive floral perfume, the same scent that used to fill my house during her uninvited Sunday visits, when she would criticize my cooking and inspect my baseboards for dust. You should have just signed the papers, Jada, Vivian whispered. Her voice dripped with fake pity, loud enough for Terrence and his lawyer to hear. You do not even have a lawyer. You are finished. You brought this entirely on yourself by refusing to submit to your husband. I turned my head slowly and looked at her. Her chin was tilted upward. She expected me to shrink. She expected me to lower my eyes, to show fear, to break down in tears, and beg for a settlement that would leave me with nothing. For years I had played the role they assigned me. The quiet, supportive wife. The strong black woman who absorbed their disrespect, financed their failures, and maintained the peace at the expense of my own sanity. I had let them mistake my silence for submission. I looked at Vivian, then past her to Chloe, who actually rolled her eyes at me, and finally to Terrence, who offered a condescending half smile. I did not say a single word. I turned my attention back to the empty bench at the front of the room. I let the silence hang there heavy and unresolved. I knew something they did not. I knew exactly what was inside my leather briefcase. The heavy door beside the judge's bench swung open. "All rise," the bailiff announced, his voice booming across the cavernous room. "The Honorable Judge Harrison presiding." Everyone stood. Judge Harrison walked in with a brisk, no-nonsense stride. He was a formidable man, known throughout the Atlanta legal circuit for his zero-tolerance policy toward ill-prepared attorneys and frivolous motions. He took his seat, adjusted the sleeves of his black robe, and put on his reading glasses. The courtroom sat down in unison. Terrence's attorney immediately stood up, adjusting his suit jacket, ready to put on a show. He puffed out his chest, clearly prepared to steamroll the unrepresented woman sitting across from him. He opened his mouth to speak, likely to demand an immediate dismissal or a default judgment in their favor, assuming I was completely out of my depth. Judge Harrison held up a single hand, silencing the man before a single syllable could escape his lips. The judge did not even look at him. He bypassed the expensive lawyer, bypassed Terrence, and looked directly across the room at my table. The stern lines of Judge Harrison's face softened. A genuine, respectful smile broke across his features as he looked at me. "Good morning, Colonel," the judge said, his voice ringing crystal clear through the quiet courtroom. "It is an absolute honor to have you in my courtroom today." The reaction was instantaneous and cinematic. Behind me, I heard a sharp gasp, followed by the distinct thud of a heavy object hitting the floor. Vivian had dropped her designer purse. The clasp popped open, spilling her pristine life across the dirty courthouse linoleum. Her perfectly manicured hands flew to her mouth. Terrence's arrogant posture completely collapsed. His spine curved, his jaw actually unhinged, and he stared at the judge as if the man had just started speaking a foreign language. The high-priced attorney slowly lowered himself back into his chair, his confidence evaporating as he frantically shuffled through his case files, realizing he had missed something catastrophic. I glanced over my shoulder. Chloe was frozen. The smug grin had been entirely wiped from her pale face. Her phone rested limply in her hand. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The realization was crashing down on her. The woman she had tormented, the woman she had stolen from, the woman she had tried to have arrested with her weaponized tears, was not a helpless civilian freelancer. I turned back to the front of the room. I stood up tall, pulling my shoulders back, channeling 12 years of military discipline. I had spent over a decade as a judge advocate general officer. I had prosecuted high-level military financial crimes. I had built airtight federal cases that dismantled entire criminal networks. I had retired early to seek peace, but my family had decided to bring the war to my front door. They thought they could drain my bank accounts, destroy my reputation, and leave me destitute because they believed I was just a civilian who would fold under pressure. They had no idea they had picked a fight with a woman who dismantled arrogant men for a living. I looked Judge Harrison right in the eye, projecting a voice that had commanded court-martial proceedings across the globe. "Good morning, Your Honor," I replied smoothly, a polite but dangerous smile forming on my lips. "The prosecution is ready." To understand the sheer magnitude of their miscalculation, you have to understand exactly what I walked away from. When I said those words to the judge, I felt a heavy, invisible armor slide back over my shoulders. It was an armor I had deliberately buried deep in the back of my closet 3 years ago. I did not want to wear it anymore. I had spent my entire adult life wrapped in it, fighting battles that most people could not even comprehend. For 12 years I served as an officer in the Judge Advocate General Corps. I was not handling petty theft or standard disciplinary hearings. I was the lead prosecutor for a specialized task force targeting high-level military financial crimes. My jurisdiction covered the darkest, most complicated corners of defense contracting. I tracked down rogue generals siphoning operational funds into offshore accounts. I dismantled multi-million-dollar international fraud rings orchestrated by military contractors who thought they were smarter than the federal government. I spent my 20s and early 30s buried in forensic accounting, deciphering encrypted ledgers, and cross-examining hostile, highly trained military personnel who lied for a living. I lived in a world of high-stakes deception. I operated in environments where a single miscalculated question during a deposition could cost the government tens of millions of dollars or compromise national security. By the time I was 32, I had earned the rank of full colonel. I achieved that rank not by playing politics, but by being an absolute ghost in the courtroom. I learned to let arrogant men talk themselves into a corner. I learned to smile while holding the exact piece of evidence that would send them to federal prison for decades. I learned how to track a single missing dollar across 5 continents until it led me to the guilty party. But that life comes with a profound, suffocating cost. The military is relentless. The travel, the classified briefings in windowless rooms, the constant exposure to greed and corruption. It hollowed me out. I woke up one morning in a temporary housing unit overseas, looked in the mirror and realized I did not know how to be a normal person. I did not know how to go to a farmer's market. I did not know how to host a dinner party. I knew how to destroy people financially and legally, but I did not know how to just live. So I walked away. I secured an honorable discharge and took an early retirement. I wanted peace. I desperately craved the mundane, ordinary civilian life that I had watched other people enjoy from the sidelines. I moved to Atlanta, bought a beautiful historic home with my military pension and savings, and decided to reinvent myself. I stripped away the title of colonel. I locked away the commendations, the medals, and the uniform. I wanted to be Jada, just Jada. A woman who could tend to her garden, drink coffee on her front porch, and build a quiet, peaceful existence. To maintain my income without re-entering the corporate meat grinder. I launched a boutique independent risk management consultancy. On paper, it sounded incredibly boring. That was intentional. I told everyone I met that I was a freelance consultant who helped small companies manage their liabilities and clean up their spreadsheets. I played the part of a quiet, unassuming remote worker who typed on her laptop in local coffee shops. In reality, my consultancy was a highly classified operation. The Department of Defense and various federal agencies retained me on exclusive closed-door contracts to audit highly sensitive supply chains. I was doing the exact same forensic financial work I had done in the military, but entirely on my own terms, from the comfort of my home office, without the uniform. My security clearance remained active and at the highest possible level. My network of federal investigators, forensic accountants, and military judges remained intact and deeply loyal. But I kept that reality strictly segregated from my personal life. I instituted a hard firewall between my federal contracts and my civilian identity. When I entered the dating pool, I was hyper-vigilant. I knew that women with power, wealth, and high military rank often intimidated civilian men. I did not want a man who wanted me for my status, my money, or my federal connections. I wanted a partner who loved the quiet, simple version of me. I wanted someone who would cherish the woman watering the hydrangeas in the backyard, not the colonel who put corrupt defense contractors behind bars. That desire for normalcy was my biggest vulnerability. It blinded me. It made me susceptible to the very kind of deception I used to prosecute. When I met Terrence, I thought I had found my safe harbor. He presented himself as a charming, ambitious entrepreneur who valued family above all else. He did not ask too many questions about my freelance work, and I thought that was because he respected my boundaries. I thought he loved my quiet demeanor. I thought his family, with their loud Sunday dinners and prominent church presence, was the warm, welcoming community I had sacrificed during my years of service. I deliberately shrank myself to fit into their world. Whenever Terrence brought up his business ventures, I played the supportive, financially conservative girlfriend and eventually the dutiful wife. When his mother Vivian and his stepsister Chloe asked about my job, I kept my answers vague and boring. I told them I did risk assessment paperwork. I watched their eyes glaze over with disinterest, and I felt a sense of relief. I thought my secret was safe. I thought my peaceful civilian camouflage was working flawlessly. I never corrected them when they assumed my income was meager. I never corrected them when they assumed I lacked business acumen. I swallowed my pride and bit my tongue, because I believed that protecting my peace was more important than proving my competence. I handed over the narrative of my life to them, allowing them to cast me as the plain, unremarkable freelancer who was incredibly lucky to be married into their golden, affluent family. I wanted so badly to be a normal civilian wife that I completely ignored the red flags. I ignored the way Terrence constantly needed to be the center of financial authority in our household. I ignored the way Vivian subtly monitored our bank accounts, conditioning Terrence to view my money as communal family funding. I ignored Chloe constantly sniffing around my home office, trying to figure out how I afforded a premarital house in one of the most expensive zip codes in the city. I traded my military instincts for the illusion of a happy family. I willingly walked into their trap because I believed their smiles were genuine. I let them think I was soft. I let them think I was malleable. I let them think that my quietness was a symptom of weakness, rather than the disciplined restraint of a woman who was trained to observe everything and say nothing until the time was right. They built a narrative where I was nothing but a stepping stone for their ambitions. They looked at my modest explanations about my consultancy and saw a naive woman they could easily exploit. They looked at my desire for family and saw a profound, exploitable desperation. They saw a victim. They had absolutely no idea that the woman pouring their iced tea at Sunday dinner was a decorated federal prosecutor who could trace a laundered penny through a dozen offshore accounts blindfolded. They did not know the past I was hiding, and because they did not know my past, they drastically underestimated my capacity for total calculated retaliation. Terrence was the sun around which his family revolved. To understand how I walked into their trap, you have to understand the blinding glare of his upbringing. He was a handsome, charismatic man who wore ambition like a tailored suit. In the affluent circles of Atlanta society, he was paraded around as the ultimate prize. His mother Vivian had spent 3 decades meticulously crafting a dynasty of social perfection, and Terrence was her absolute masterpiece. Vivian treated him like an infallible king. He was never a man who made mistakes. He was only a man who was misunderstood by a world not ready for his genius. If a business venture failed, Vivian blamed the market. If he lost a major client, Vivian blamed a lack of vision from his partners. He was insulated from consequence, raised in a protective bubble of fierce maternal adoration that crippled his ability to take actual accountability for his life. Vivian was the true architect of this dynamic. She was a powerful force within their massive megachurch and the local charity gala circuit. She curated their family image with ruthless precision. To Vivian, appearances were a currency more valuable than actual wealth. She demanded absolute loyalty and total submission to the family brand. When Terrence brought me home, Vivian did not see a partner for her son. She saw a demographic fit. She saw a quiet, respectable Black woman with a steady, unassuming freelance job and no messy family baggage. I was supposed to be the perfect background accessory. My role was to host Sunday dinners, keep the house immaculate, and swallow my pride to inflate Terrence's ego. Vivian viewed my financial independence not as an asset to a marriage, but as a direct threat to her son's authority. That was why she constantly diminished my work, referring to my highly classified federal consulting as my little side hustle. She needed me to feel small so Terrence could feel large. But to truly grasp the toxic, suffocating ecosystem of this family, you have to understand the anomaly that was Chloe. Chloe was Terrence's white stepsister. Terrence's late father had briefly married a white woman before he passed away, leaving a teenage Chloe effectively orphaned and adrift. Vivian did not owe this girl anything, but Vivian was a master of social engineering. She took Chloe in, housing her, funding her, and presenting her to the community as her own. It was not done out of the goodness of her heart. Vivian realized that having a white stepdaughter in their prominent, affluent African-American family was the ultimate accessory. It projected an image of supreme grace, boundless inclusivity, and modern progressive wealth. It made Vivian look like a saint. Chloe was a prop to Vivian, but Chloe was not stupid. She quickly learned how to play the game. She realized early on that Vivian would never let her fail, because Chloe's failure would reflect poorly on Vivian's pristine charity record. So Chloe weaponized her position. She was spoiled beyond human comprehension. She drifted from one expensive, meaningless hobby to another funded entirely by Vivian and eventually by Terrence. Chloe possessed a terrifyingly effective victim complex. She understood the power of weaponized fragility. If anyone ever challenged her, she deployed her tears with tactical military precision. She knew exactly how to widen her blue eyes, let her voice tremble and trigger Vivian's protective instincts and Terrence's misplaced sense of fraternal duty. She played the delicate flower to absolute perfection. I saw right through Chloe from day one. In my former life, I sat across interrogation tables from hardened international criminals who tried to fake remorse. Chloe's manufactured innocence was amateurish to me, but I kept my mouth shut. I watched her manipulate the room every single Sunday. She would sit at my dining room table eating the food I cooked and drop a perfectly casual comment about needing capital for her new holistic wellness brand. She would let a single tear slip down her cheek, talking about how hard it was to be a young female entrepreneur trying to find her way in the world. Vivian would immediately turn her sharp gaze to Terrence, pressuring him to step up as the man of the family and support his sister. Terrence, desperate to maintain his status as the wealthy, benevolent provider in front of his mother, would immediately agree to fund whatever ridiculous venture Chloe was pitching. And because Terrence's actual businesses were consistently hemorrhaging money behind closed doors, that meant the funds invariably came from me. Terrence would come to me later that night, claiming he had a temporary cash flow issue and needed to borrow from my savings to float Chloe's business until his next big deal closed. Chloe resented me deeply. She resented that I did not fawn over her like the rest of the congregation. She resented that I did not offer her unearned praise for her mediocre ideas. Most of all, she resented that I held the purse strings to the lifestyle she believed she was inherently entitled to. She would make backhanded, passive-aggressive comments about my clothes, my house, and my quiet demeanor. She would sip her wine and say things like, "It is so brave of you to just be a freelancer when Terrence is out there doing such important high-stress work." She loved asserting her dominance, leveraging her white privilege while safely wrapped in the protective bubble of Vivian's influence. Chloe knew exactly what she was doing. She knew that as a black woman entering this established image-obsessed family, I was locked into a social trap. I was expected to bite my tongue and bear it. If I ever raised my voice to Chloe, if I ever called out her manipulation, I would instantly be painted as the angry, aggressive, unsupportive outsider attacking the fragile, inclusive harmony Vivian had so carefully manufactured. Chloe knew society would look at her tears and my anger and immediately side with her. So I played along. I served the iced tea. I smiled politely at her thinly veiled insults. I let her think she was the smartest person in the room. I let Vivian believe she had successfully broken my spirit and molded me into the submissive wife she required for her son. Every time Chloe batted her eyelashes and secured another massive loan from Terrence for a crystal healing pop-up or a vegan skincare line, I did not scream. I did not fight. I simply went into my home office, opened my encrypted hard drive and documented the transaction. I noted the date. I tracked the routing numbers. I pulled the public business filings for her fake companies. I treated my marriage the way I treated a suspect under federal surveillance. I gathered intelligence. They all believed they were using me to prop up their golden image. They believed they were bleeding a naive, boring civilian dry to fund their illusions of grandeur. They thought my silence was compliance. They had absolutely no idea. They were simply providing me with a meticulously documented paper trail of their own impending destruction. The Sundays were the most grueling battlefield of all. The expectation was set the moment I married into the family. I was required to be up at 6 in the morning, standing in my kitchen preparing a massive, flawless spread. Roast beef, macaroni, and cheese from scratch collard greens that required hours of prep, homemade rolls. This was not a joyful family tradition. It was a mandate. It was Vivian testing my submission, under the guise of fellowship. I was the host, the chef, the maid, and the silent audience for their grandiosity. Vivian and Chloe would arrive promptly at 2 in the afternoon. They would step through my front door, their designer heels clicking over the hardwood floors I had spent my Saturday night polishing. Chloe would inevitably walk into my kitchen empty-handed, wrinkling her nose and announce a brand new dietary restriction she had just discovered on social media. She would expect me to drop everything and whip up a gluten-free, dairy-free organic alternative just for her. I never argued. I chopped the extra vegetables. I smiled a quiet, agreeable smile. Once we were seated in the formal dining room, the hierarchy of their world was put on full display. Terrence sat at the head of the table, commanding the room. Vivian sat to his immediate right, holding court. Chloe sat to his left, basking in their attention. I was constantly in motion, getting up to refill water glasses, bringing extra napkins, clearing plates. When I finally took my seat, the interrogation dressed as polite conversation would begin. Vivian would stir her iced tea, look at me with eyes as cold as a winter morning, and ask about my work. She never called it a business or a firm. It was always diminished. So Jada, how is your little freelance gig going? Are you still doing that typing work from home? You know Terrence has a colleague who is looking for a reliable administrative assistant if you need some steady income. I would calmly slice my food and reply that my projects were keeping me appropriately busy. Chloe would immediately chime in, reaching across the table to pat Terrence on the arm. She would say it was just so sweet that Terrence allowed me to play businesswoman in the spare room while he handled the actual crushing pressure of building a real empire. Terrence would offer a modest, suffering smile, accepting the praise for carrying the family on his broad shoulders. The reality of Terrence's empire was a masterclass in smoke and mirrors. Terrence was a serial entrepreneur who completely lacked the discipline, intelligence, and work ethic required to actually run a business. He was obsessed with the aesthetic of wealth. He loved printing thick, glossy business cards. He loved hosting expensive networking lunches at private clubs. He loved calling himself a chief executive officer. He launched a boutique logistics company that owned absolutely no trucks. He started a high-end consulting firm that secured absolutely no clients. Every time reality caught up with his delusions, and the creditors started calling the confident, booming man who commanded the Sunday dinner table transformed into a desperate, manipulative victim behind the closed doors of our bedroom. The financial squeeze always followed the exact same script. He would pace the floor at midnight, rubbing his temples, performing exhaustion. He would launch into a monologue about unfair market conditions and unexpected overhead costs that were completely out of his control. Then he would pivot. He would look at me with wounded, heavy eyes and deploy the ultimate weapon Vivian had sharpened for him. He would tell me that the world was already built to tear down an ambitious black man. He would say he was fighting a system rigged against him, and the only way he could win was if he had a partner who believed in his vision. He needed his wife to be his rock. He needed me to stand in the gap. He was weaponizing my loyalty. He was twisting the genuine systemic struggles of our community into a personal guilt-driven ATM. Vivian reinforced this psychological trap at every opportunity. She would corner me in the kitchen while I was washing their dishes, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial, matriarchal whisper. We have to hold our men up, Jada. A strong black woman knows how to sacrifice her own comfort for her family's legacy. You do not want to be one of those bitter, selfish wives who tears down her husband's dreams over a few dollars. A good wife provides. She framed financial abuse as cultural solidarity. If I questioned a sudden transfer of funds, I was emasculating him. If I asked to see a business plan before writing a check, I lacked faith in his leadership. I was expected to empty my bank accounts with a serene smile, proving my worth and my love through absolute financial martyrdom. And so the bleeding began. $5,000 here to cover a marketing campaign that produced nothing. $10,000 there to cover payroll for a phantom staff of contractors he had hired to make himself look important. Then came the funding for Chloe. Terrence would announce he was investing in his sister's brand, proudly declaring that family builds wealth together. But the money he was investing was entirely mine. When I calmly pointed out that Chloe's last venture, a luxury dog yoga studio, had folded in 3 weeks, Terrence exploded. He called me jealous. He said I was small-minded because I was content working for a paycheck instead of building generational wealth. I became the silent workhorse, carrying the physical, emotional, and financial weight of their opulent, fabricated lifestyle. I paid the mortgage on the house I owned before I met him. I covered the soaring utility bills. I funded the expensive groceries for those lavish Sunday dinners where they sat at my table and mocked my career. Terrence drove a luxury SUV, but I made the monthly payments. He wore bespoke suits, but my debit card was on file with the tailor. They lived like absolute royalty on the back of the woman they treated like a peasant. The exhaustion was bone deep. There were moments standing over a hot stove listening to their cruel laughter drift in from the dining room, where my hands shook with the urge to shatter a plate against the wall. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw them out into the street. But my military discipline held me together like iron. I knew that reacting emotionally would give them the exact ammunition they craved. Vivian would clutch her pearls and call me unstable. Terrence would play the long-suffering husband dealing with an erratic wife. Chloe would cry and play the victim, so I maintained my cover. Every time Terrence demanded another transfer to save his failing businesses or fund Chloe's vanity projects. I calmly opened my laptop. I nodded. I made the transfer. Then I opened my encrypted classified files. I logged the exact date, the precise amount, the receiving account routing number, and the stated purpose of the funds. I watched my civilian savings slowly drain away, but I was not breaking. I was building a barricade. I was letting them dig a financial grave so deep they would never be able to climb out. They thought they were breaking a strong black woman into submission. They did not realize they were meticulously arming a federal prosecutor. I parked my car in the driveway of my historic Atlanta home on a Tuesday afternoon. The flight back from Washington, D.C. had been grueling. To Terrence, Vivian, and Chloe. I had just spent 3 days in a mid-level hotel attending a mind-numbing risk compliance seminar for freelance administrators. They had waved me off with polite, patronizing smiles, completely uninterested in my itinerary. In reality, I had been inside a secure, windowless briefing room at the Pentagon. I had been auditing a compromised logistics network for a classified naval operation, sitting across a heavy oak table from 4-star generals who hung on my every word. I had spent 72 hours operating at the absolute highest level of strategic analysis, unraveling complex webs of international procurement fraud. I was mentally exhausted. I just wanted to drop my bags, brew a cup of chamomile tea, and sink into the quiet, pristine solitude of my house before Terrence returned from whatever fake executive networking lunch he claimed to be attending today. Walking through the front door, the silence of the house usually wrapped around me like a comforting blanket. It was my sanctuary, the only place where I did not have to be on guard. Today the quiet felt different. The air felt stagnant, almost heavy. I left my luggage in the foyer, slipped off my heels, and walked straight back to my home office. I needed to handle a few mundane civilian tasks before I could truly switch off and decompress. I had to pay the vendor who repaired our HVAC system last week, and I needed to transfer the funds to cover the extravagant organic grocery bill for Vivian's upcoming Sunday dinner. I sat down at my desk, pushed aside a scattered stack of Terrence's glossy, meaningless business cards, and opened my personal laptop. I navigated to my civilian banking portal. This was the primary account I used to manage the household and my personal wealth. It held the liquid savings I had accumulated from my early frugal years in the military, and the substantial, heavily taxed profits from my unclassified civilian consulting contracts. It was my safety net. It was my emergency fund. It was the financial bedrock that gave me the peace of mind to endure my in-laws' daily disrespect without snapping. I typed in my password, authenticated the login with the biometric scan on my phone, and waited for the familiar financial dashboard to load. I reached for my tea, expecting to see the comfortable 6-figure balance that proved I was secure, independent, and protected. The screen refreshed. I froze. My hand stopped completely suspended halfway to my mug. I blinked hard, assuming my exhausted brain was misreading the placement of the decimal point, or that the bank's server was experiencing a display glitch. I refreshed the browser. I logged out, cleared my cache, and logged back in. The numbers did not change. The balance on my primary savings account was not in the 6 figures. It was barely in the 3 figures. $150,000 was completely gone. A sharp, icy spike of adrenaline shot straight through my chest, pinning me to the back of my chair. For exactly 10 seconds, I let myself feel the absolute paralyzing panic of a betrayed civilian wife. My breathing hitched in my throat. My stomach dropped into a bottomless, nauseating void. My ears rang with the sudden rush of my own pulse. That money represented years of my life. It represented dangerous deployments, sleepless nights reading dense legal briefs, and the highly disciplined, frugal choices I had made to ensure I would never ever be financially dependent on anyone else. It was the foundation of the quiet life I had built here in Atlanta, and it had been wiped completely clean with the clinical, devastating efficiency of a vacuum. But I did not allow myself to panic for an 11th second. The fragile, supportive, devastated civilian wife vanished. She was immediately replaced by the military prosecutor. I felt the familiar cold detachment wash over my brain, shutting down my emotional receptors and activating my analytical training. I stopped looking at the missing balance and immediately started looking at the transaction history. A bank statement is not a tragedy. To a federal prosecutor, a bank statement is a crime scene. I clicked on the detailed statement view and expanded the transaction ledger for the past 30 days. The money had not vanished in a slow, gradual bleed of mounting expenses. It had been moved in 3 massive staggered wire transfers over the past 48 hours. It happened while I was locked inside the secure briefing room at the Pentagon, entirely without access to my personal devices or civilian email alerts. It was a coordinated, deliberate extraction. I analyzed the destination codes. The routing numbers did not belong to a random overseas hacker or an anonymous phishing scammer. I recognized the receiving bank institution. I recognized the account structure. They were domestic transfers routed directly from my sole savings account into a joint checking account I had foolishly opened with Terrence when we first got married, simply to cover shared utility bills. From that joint checking account, the funds had been immediately drained again, bounced to an external corporate account to obscure the final destination. I opened a secure browser window and pulled the public state registry data for the destination routing number. I ran a quick cross-reference on the corporate entity. The beneficiary was a newly registered limited liability company operating under the classification of holistic health and wellness. It was Chloe. Terrence had not just borrowed a few $1,000s to cover a bad month or patch a hole in his fake logistics company. He had completely gutted my life savings. He had emptied my personal accounts, taken the entirety of my liquid wealth, and handed it directly to his spoiled, manipulative white stepsister to fund a fake business. The sheer audacity of the theft was staggering. He did this while I was away. He timed it perfectly, exploiting the travel schedule I had shared with him. He knew I would be distracted. He probably thought I would not check the balances until the end of the month to pay the mortgage. He thought he could steal a fortune from his own wife, pour it into the bottomless black hole of Chloe's vanity projects, and then gaslight me into accepting it when I eventually noticed the missing funds. He relied on Vivian's conditioning. He relied on the assumption that I would prioritize the peace of our marriage over the security of my own finances. He banked heavily on the strong black woman trope, assuming I would simply absorb the massive loss, wipe away my tears, forgive his ambitious overreach, and work twice as hard to build the money all back up from scratch. He believed I was so desperate to maintain my position in his golden family that I would swallow a felony. I sat back in my desk chair. The house was still perfectly quiet. The late afternoon sun streamed through the plantation shutters, casting warm golden light across the mahogany surface of my desk. Everything in the room looked exactly as I had left it, but my entire reality had fundamentally shifted. I did not scream. I did not throw my coffee mug against the wall. I did not call my girlfriends to cry about my treacherous lying husband. I closed my civilian laptop. I stood up, walked over to my locked filing cabinet, and retrieved my secondary heavily encrypted hard drive. I sat back down at my desk and began to build a timeline. I was going to map every single digital footprint he left behind. I was going to capture the timestamp of every transfer, the IP address of every login, and the digital signature on every authorization form. Terrence had crossed a massive, unforgivable line. He had transitioned from a manipulative, insecure husband into a brazen thief. He thought he had just secured a massive payday for his mother's golden family. He thought he had put the quiet, boring freelancer in her place. He had absolutely no idea he had just handed a veteran federal prosecutor the motive, the means, and the opportunity to completely dismantle his life. From the front of the house, I heard the distinct sound of his luxury SUV pulling into the driveway. The expensive tires crunched over the gravel. I heard the heavy front door click open, followed by the jingle of his keys hitting the entryway table. "Honey, I am home." His booming, overly confident voice echoed through the foyer. I took one last deep breath, locked away the final traces of my civilian vulnerability, and stood up to go greet my prime suspect. I walked out of my office and stood at the end of the hallway. Terrence was in the foyer, shrugging off his tailored suit jacket. He looked incredibly pleased with himself. He caught sight of me and flashed that $1,000,000 smile, the one that used to make my heart skip a beat. I did not smile back. I asked him a very simple, direct question. Where is the $150,000 from my primary savings account? I expected him to freeze. I expected a moment of panic, a stutter, a frantic attempt to cover his tracks. But Terrence did not panic. He did not look guilty. He looked annoyed. He sighed heavily, draped his jacket over the banister, and loosened his silk tie. He walked right past me into the kitchen, heading straight for the liquor cabinet. "I was going to talk to you about that over dinner," he said, pouring himself a glass of bourbon. His tone was casual, as if we were discussing a slightly overgrown lawn rather than a six-figure theft. "You really need to stop checking the accounts the second you get off a plane, Jada. It is bad for your stress levels." I followed him into the kitchen. My voice remained completely flat. "You transferred $150,000 of my money into a joint account and then immediately wired it to an LLC registered to Chloe. Explain it." Terrence took a sip of his drink and leaned against the granite counter. He looked at me with an expression of profound manufactured disappointment. He was shifting into the role his mother had trained him for his entire life. He was playing the visionary martyr burdened by a small-minded wife. "I did not transfer your money," he said, emphasizing the word "your" with a sneer. "I moved our family assets. I made a strategic executive decision to diversify our portfolio." Chloe pitched a brilliant concept for a holistic wellness and retreat brand. "It is an untapped market, Jada." She just needed seed capital to secure the trademark and vendor contracts. "I invested in my sister." "You invested my life savings into a fake company run by a woman who could not keep a dog yoga studio open for a month," I replied, my voice dangerously quiet. "And you did it behind my back." That was the trigger he was waiting for. The casual arrogance dropped, replaced by immediate aggressive hostility. He set his glass down hard on the counter. The loud clack of glass against stone was meant to intimidate me. He took 2 steps toward me, using his height and his broad shoulders to dominate the physical space. In my previous life, I had stared down combat veterans who could snap a man's neck with their bare hands. Terrence puffing out his chest in a custom suit was almost comical. "This is exactly why I could not tell you," he barked, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "This right here. Your entire mindset is toxic. You are so obsessed with hoarding every little penny you make from your freelance gig that you cannot see the bigger picture. I am trying to build generational wealth for this family, and you are acting like a selfish, small-minded accountant." He pointed a finger at me, leaning closer. "My mother raised me to understand one fundamental truth. Family supports family. When someone in this family has a vision, we pool our resources and we elevate them. But you do not know anything about that, do you? You are too busy keeping score. You are too busy trying to be the man of the house." There it was, the ultimate trump card in his psychological arsenal. The accusation of emasculation. "You want to talk about being the man of the house," I said, keeping my posture perfectly rigid, refusing to yield a single inch of ground. "A man does not steal from his wife to fund his stepsister's vanity projects because his own businesses are failing." Terrence's eyes flashed with genuine rage. I had hit the nerve, but he doubled down on the gaslighting. He completely ignored his own business failures and focused all his energy on attacking my character. "You are unbelievable," he spat, shaking his head in mock disgust. "Do you have any idea how exhausting it is to be married to a woman who constantly undermines her husband? A real wife, a supportive Black woman, would look at her husband taking charge of the family finances and feel secure. She would trust his leadership. Instead, you interrogate me like I am a criminal. You emasculate me every chance you get. You want me to beg for scraps from my own wife just to make a business move." He began pacing the kitchen floor, waving his hands, putting on a masterful theatrical performance. He was hitting every buzzword Vivian had ever taught him. "I am out there networking, grinding, trying to secure a legacy," he shouted. "Chloe came to me because she respects my business acumen. She respects my leadership. She looked to me as the head of this family to provide guidance and capital." What was I supposed to do? Tell her my wife will not let me access our money. Tell her I have to ask permission to be a man. I watched him perform. The military prosecutor inside my head was taking clinical notes. He was displaying textbook narcissistic deflection. Deny the theft. Reframe the crime as a noble act. Attack the victim's character. Use cultural expectations to induce guilt. It was a classic Darvo maneuver: deny, attack, and reverse victim and offender. "The money was not yours to invest, Terrence," I stated calmly, cutting through his dramatic monologue. "It was the sole property of my primary savings account. You used the joint account as a pass-through. That is wire fraud." Terrence let out a loud, mocking laugh. He threw his head back, genuinely amused by my terminology. "Wire fraud," he chuckled, shaking his head. "Listen to yourself, Jada. You do some risk assessment paperwork for mid-level corporate drones, and suddenly you think you are a lawyer. It is marital property. We are married. What is yours is mine. There is no fraud when a husband moves money to build a family business. My mother warned me about this. She warned me that your independent streak was just a cover for deep-seated selfishness." He walked back over to his bourbon and picked up the glass. He took a slow, deliberate sip, looking at me with absolute contempt. "You need to fix your attitude, Jada. You need to pray on this and ask God to soften your heart," he said, weaponizing the church rhetoric Vivian loved so much. "Because right now you are acting like an enemy to this family. Chloe is family. I am your husband. We are building an empire. You can either get on board and support the vision, or you can stay mad in your little home office while we make millions." "I want the money transferred back by the end of the week," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. Terrence smiled a cold, vicious smile. "That is not going to happen. The funds are already locked into vendor contracts, marketing retainers, and commercial lease deposits. The money is gone, Jada. It is working. It is invested. So I suggest you wipe that angry look off your face, get in the kitchen, and figure out what we are having for dinner. I am tired, and I am not going to let your toxic energy ruin my evening." He turned his back on me. He walked out of the kitchen, taking his bourbon with him, heading for the master suite to take a shower. He walked away with the swagger of a man who believed he had just successfully dominated his wife. He thought he had crushed my rebellion. He thought the mention of his mother, the accusation of emasculation, and the invocation of family loyalty had effectively silenced me. I stood alone in the kitchen. I listened to his heavy footsteps echo up the stairs. I listened to the master bathroom door close. I heard the water turn on. I was right about one thing. The money was gone. But he was catastrophically wrong about everything else. I was not a toxic, selfish wife hoarding pennies. I was a highly trained federal investigator who had just been handed a verbal confession to the unauthorized transfer of funds. He had confirmed he moved the money. He had confirmed the destination. He had confirmed his intent to deprive me of the assets permanently. I did not shed a single tear. I did not feel the urge to scream. The final lingering thread of my civilian vulnerability, the part of me that still wanted to believe my husband loved me, withered and died right there on the kitchen floor. It was replaced by a cold, absolute resolve. The marriage was over. The legal war had officially begun. And Terrence had just fired the first shot directly into the shield of a woman who never ever lost a battle. The summons came the very next morning. My phone vibrated on the kitchen island at precisely 8 o'clock. It was a text message from Vivian containing only 2 sentences. "We are having a family meeting at noon. Do not be late." It was not a request. It was a royal decree. I did not reply. I finished my black coffee, dressed in a sharp, tailored navy suit that mirrored my military uniform without breaking my civilian cover, and drove to Vivian's sprawling estate in Buckhead. Vivian lived in a massive red brick mansion that looked less like a home and more like a fortress of social dominance. The circular driveway was lined with perfectly manicured hedges. Everything about the property was designed to intimidate visitors before they even reached the front steps. I parked my car, walked up to the heavy mahogany double doors, and let myself in. I was directed by Vivian's housekeeper to the formal living room. This was a room nobody ever actually lived in. It was a showroom of expensive antique furniture, velvet drapes, and family portraits strategically arranged to project absolute perfection. I walked through the arched doorway and immediately recognized the tactical layout of the room. It was a coordinated ambush. Vivian sat in a high-backed wing chair at the center of the room, positioned exactly like a monarch holding court. She wore a pristine white pantsuit, her posture rigid, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Chloe was perched on the edge of a matching velvet sofa, to Vivian's right. Chloe wore expensive designer activewear, sipping sparkling water from a crystal glass, radiating a smug, untouchable energy. Terrence was seated to Vivian's left. He did not look like the aggressive, booming man who had shouted at me in our kitchen the night before. Today, he was playing a completely different character. He slouched in his chair, staring down at the Persian rug, projecting the image of a deeply wounded, exhausted man who had been pushed to his absolute breaking point by a difficult wife. "Have a seat," Jada Vivian commanded, gesturing to a single stiff-backed chair positioned directly across from them. I took the seat. I kept my spine straight, my knees crossed, and my hands resting loosely on my lap. I did not fidget. I did not speak. I let Vivian make the first move. "Terrence came to me last night, deeply distressed." Vivian began, her voice dripping with artificial maternal sorrow. "He told me about the hostility he faced when he returned home. He told me how you interrogated him, how you raised your voice, and how you completely dismissed his efforts to build wealth for this family." I looked at Terrence. He refused to meet my eyes. He had run straight to his mother to craft a narrative where he was the victim of my financial abuse. "Jada, you are a smart girl," Vivian continued, softening her tone to a condescending purr. "But you lack spiritual and marital wisdom. A house divided against itself cannot stand. When a husband makes a business decision, a godly wife does not attack him. She supports him. Terrence is the head of your household. His confidence is the engine that drives your marriage. When you challenge his financial authority, you emasculate him. You castrate his ambition." Chloe chimed in, leaning forward with a look of manufactured empathy. "It is just really sad, Jada. Terrence is trying so hard to build a legacy for all of us. When you hold on so tightly to your own little accounts, it puts a lot of negative energy into the relationship. When you marry someone, there is no mine and yours. It is all supposed to be ours. Family supports family." I stared at Chloe. The absolute audacity of a spoiled white stepsister lecturing a black woman about marital sacrifice, less than 24 hours after receiving $150,000 of my stolen life savings, was staggering. But I did not react. I let them keep talking. I let them reveal the full extent of their agenda. "Your independence is a problem," Jada Vivian said, her voice dropping the fake sweetness and turning sharp. "You hold your premarital house over his head. You keep your finances separate like you are planning an exit strategy. That creates instability. Terrence cannot function as a provider and a leader when his wife is constantly reminding him that she has her own sanctuary. It makes him feel small. And a man who feels small cannot build an empire." She reached down to the glass coffee table and picked up a thick manila folder. She slid it smoothly across the glass until it stopped directly in front of me. "We need to fix the foundation of this marriage today," Vivian declared. "We need to restore Terrence's confidence and bring your household into proper alignment." I looked down at the folder. I did not touch it. "What is this?" I asked, my voice calm and perfectly level. "It is a quitclaim deed," Vivian stated smoothly. "It transfers the title of your house into Terrence's name, or at the very least adds him as the primary joint owner with rights of survivorship." The silence in the room became absolute. I let the magnitude of her demand hang in the air. They were not satisfied with draining my liquid savings. They wanted my real estate. They wanted the historic home I had purchased, with the money I earned surviving military deployments. They wanted to strip me of my final piece of leverage, erase my sanctuary, and hand the deed to a man who did not know how to pay a water bill on time. "It is a gesture of faith," Chloe added, crossing her legs and taking a delicate sip of her water. It proves that you are actually committed to the marriage. If you have nothing to hide, and if you really believe in Terrence signing it, should not be a big deal. I looked at Terrence. He finally raised his head and met my gaze. His eyes were cold and expectant. He genuinely believed I was going to break. He believed the combined pressure of his mother's authority, Chloe's privileged manipulation, and his own performed victimhood would crush me into submission. He thought I was a cornered animal. I did not touch the pen resting on top of the folder. I did not open the document. I looked Vivian directly in the eye, my face a mask of absolute terrifying composure. Let me make sure I understand the objective of this meeting, I said slowly, enunciating every single word with razor-sharp precision. My husband drains $150,000 from my personal savings account while I am away on a business trip. He transfers those funds to a fraudulent LLC registered to his stepsister. And your proposed solution to this marital conflict is that I surrender the deed to my home to repair his self-esteem. Vivian's posture stiffened. Her eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. You are entirely missing the point, Jada. You are focusing on the money instead of the principle. I am focusing on the felony. I corrected her, my voice dropping an octave, carrying the distinct commanding resonance I used when cross-examining hostile witnesses. Chloe scoffed loudly, rolling her eyes. Oh my God, Jada, stop being so dramatic. Nobody committed a felony. It is community property. I ignored Chloe completely. I kept my eyes locked on Vivian. I am not signing over the deed to my house, I stated, my tone leaving absolutely zero room for negotiation. I am not funding Chloe's fake wellness startup. And I am not going to sit here and listen to you weaponize my culture and my marriage to justify grand larceny. Terrence shot up from his chair, his face twisting with rage. See? He yelled, pointing at me while looking at his mother. This is what I have to deal with. Disrespect. Total disrespect. She thinks she is untouchable. Vivian held up a hand, silencing her son. She stared at me, the mask of the loving matriarch completely gone. She looked at me with pure, unadulterated venom. You are making a very foolish decision today, Jada, Vivian warned, her voice a low, menacing hiss. You think you can walk into my family, defy my guidance, disrespect my son, and keep your little comfortable life. You have no idea how things work in this city. You have no idea what I can do to you. If you walk out that door without signing that paper, you will leave this family with nothing. We will take everything from you. I stood up. I smoothed the non-existent wrinkles from my navy suit jacket. I looked down at the three of them, my expression completely void of fear. I want my $150,000 returned to my primary account by close of business on Friday, I said, delivering my final ultimatum. If the funds are not replaced, my next conversation will not be a family meeting. I turned around and walked out of the formal living room. I did not run. I did not rush. I walked with the measured, steady stride of a woman who had just gathered all the intelligence she needed. I heard Terrence cursing loudly behind me, followed by Chloe's frantic, high-pitched complaints and Vivian's sharp voice barking orders. I walked out of the heavy mahogany doors and stepped into the bright Atlanta sunlight. The trap had been sprung, but they had caught the wrong prey. They thought they were sending a disobedient civilian wife home to panic and cry. They had no idea they had just handed a federal prosecutor the ultimate declaration of war. I waited exactly 72 hours. Friday at 5 o'clock arrived. I sat at my desk watching the digital clock on my monitor flip to 5:01. I refreshed my banking portal. The balance remained stagnant. The $150,000 was not returned. I closed the laptop. The warning phase of this engagement had officially concluded. Terrence did not come home that night. He did not come home the next night either. I assumed he was staying at Vivian's estate, crafting his next maneuver under his mother's meticulous direction. I expected a petty retaliation. I expected him to drain the joint checking account or cancel the credit cards tied to my name. I vastly underestimated Vivian's appetite for total destruction. The doorbell rang on Tuesday morning. I opened the door to find a tired-looking man in a wrinkled polo shirt holding a thick manila envelope. He asked to confirm my identity. When I nodded, he thrust the envelope into my hands, muttered a rehearsed legal disclaimer, and hurried back to his sedan. I walked into my foyer, broke the seal, and pulled out the stack of documents. It was a petition for dissolution of marriage. Terrence had filed for divorce. I stood in the hallway reading the paperwork with the clinical detachment of a legal auditor. The sheer audacity of the claims was breathtaking. Terrence was not just filing for a standard divorce. He was petitioning the court for emergency spousal support. He had checked the box claiming he was entirely financially dependent on me. He requested that I be ordered to pay his legal fees, maintain his health insurance, and provide a monthly alimony stipend so he could maintain the standard of living he had grown accustomed to during our marriage. He wanted to keep driving his luxury SUV on my dime while divorcing me for refusing to hand over my house. But Vivian was a tactician, and a simple divorce was not enough to satisfy her bruised ego. 3 days later, a second process server arrived. This time, the envelope was twice as thick. It was a civil lawsuit filed in Fulton County Superior Court. I carried it to my dining room table and spread the pages out. Terrence was suing me for corporate embezzlement and breach of fiduciary duty. I read through the allegations, my jaw tightening. The narrative Vivian and Terrence had concocted was a masterclass in projection. The lawsuit alleged that I had used my position as the household financial manager to illegally siphon $150,000 from Terrence's logistics company. They were claiming that my independent consultancy was actually a front-a-shell company I had created to launder his hard-earned business capital. They claimed I had deliberately starved his operations of necessary cash flow, causing his business to fail, while I hoarded his wealth in secret accounts. They were actively framing me for the exact crime Terrence had just committed. It was a brilliant, terrifyingly effective legal trap designed for a civilian. By filing the embezzlement lawsuit alongside the divorce, Terrence's attorney had immediate grounds to file an emergency injunction. They were petitioning the court to freeze all of my civilian assets, including my home equity and my remaining checking accounts, pending the outcome of the fraud investigation. Their goal was mathematical and ruthless. They wanted to cut off my access to capital, so I could not afford to hire a defense attorney. They intended to bleed me dry in preliminary hearings, drown me in discovery requests, and starve me out until I was forced to sign a settlement surrendering everything just to survive. Vivian did not stop at weaponizing the judicial system. A lawsuit is public record, and Vivian knew exactly how to leverage that. By Friday afternoon, my phone started buzzing with notifications. Links were being sent to me by confused, distant acquaintances. Vivian had leaked the lawsuit to a prominent local blog that covered Atlanta high society and church gossip. The headline was sensationalized, painting Terrence as a betrayed, hard-working entrepreneur whose ambitious business dreams were sabotaged by a greedy, manipulative wife. The article implied I was facing imminent criminal charges. They wanted me panicked. They wanted me destitute. They wanted me to feel the suffocating weight of public humiliation. They expected me to call Terrence sobbing, begging for a truce offering to sign over the deed to the house, if he would just drop the devastating lawsuits and clear my name. They thought the threat of ruin would break my spirit. They thought that freezing my local bank accounts would leave me entirely defenseless. What they did not know was that my primary civilian account was just the surface layer of my financial architecture. The $150,000 they stole was my civilian safety net, but it was not my actual wealth. My military pension, my combat pay, and the massive classified federal contracts I fulfilled for the Department of Defense were routed into a heavily secured tiered federal credit union account that Terrence did not know existed. He could not freeze what he could not find. Furthermore, his civilian lawyer did not have the security clearance to subpoena federal defense payment registries without triggering immediate alarms in Washington. I sat at my dining room table, surrounded by their fabricated lawsuits and malicious lies. I picked up a red pen and began annotating their civil complaint. I highlighted every single perjured statement. I circled every falsified timeline. They had handed me their entire playbook. They had put their lies on the public record, signing their names under penalty of perjury. I did not panic. I simply went to work. I prepared to let them build their house of cards as high as they possibly could before I kicked out the foundational pillar. Every false claim they filed was another nail in their coffin. They wanted to play legal warfare with a woman who had spent over a decade writing the manual on prosecuting financial fraud. I grabbed a fresh legal pad, clicked my pen, and began drafting the blueprint for their absolute destruction. The silence was the first weapon they deployed. In Atlanta, a prominent church is not just a place of worship. It is the absolute epicenter of your social, professional, and personal ecosystem. Greater Fellowship Tabernacle was a sprawling 10,000-member congregation. It was an institution of immense power and influence within the African American community, and I had spent the last 3 years pouring my civilian energy into that place. I organized their community outreach programs. I quietly audited their charity drives to ensure the funds actually reached the local shelters. I was the reliable, dutiful daughter-in-law who handled the logistics behind the scenes, while the Golden family took the credit on stage. But by the second Sunday after Terrence filed his fabricated lawsuit, I was a ghost. My phone, which usually buzzed with dozens of weekend brunch invitations and volunteer coordination threads, went completely dead. Vivian did not just attend Greater Fellowship. She ruled it. She sat on the executive board of trustees. She directed the women ministry. She understood exactly how to weaponize her religious status to annihilate a reputation. She did not stand at a podium and scream that I was a thief. That would be too crass, too obvious. Instead, she used the subtle, devastating art of the Southern Church prayer request. She would gather the elder women and the influential wives in the plush carpeted vestibule after service. She would clutch her chest, let her voice waver with manufactured heartbreak, and ask the congregation to lift her son up in prayer. She painted a tragic, harrowing picture of Terrence as a broken man, driven into a deep, dark depression by an emotionally volatile and financially abusive wife. She whispered that my time in the military had damaged my mind, making me paranoid and controlling. She told the pastoral staff that I had been secretly hoarding Terrence's hard-earned business capital, starving his enterprises out of sheer spiteful jealousy. She claimed I was holding my house over his head, actively refusing to create a godly, unified home, and that my financial selfishness had finally broken his spirit. In a community that placed an immense premium on protecting and elevating its successful black men, I was instantly cast as the ultimate villain. I became the ambitious, emasculating woman who wanted to destroy her husband. Vivian flipped the narrative with terrifying efficiency. She took the exact crimes her son had committed against me and projected them onto my character, wrapping the lies in scripture and maternal concern. The social isolation breached the walls of the church and spilled directly into my daily life. I realized the full suffocating extent of Vivian's smear campaign during a routine trip to the grocery store in Midtown. I was in the produce aisle inspecting a display of apples when I saw Brenda and Valerie. They were 2 women I had hosted at my dining room table just a month prior. We had baked pies together for the church holiday drive. I smiled and raised my hand to wave. Brenda's eyes widened in sudden panic. She nudged Valerie, whispered something sharp behind her hand, and they both abruptly turned their shopping cart around. They practically ran toward the dairy section, abandoning their groceries just to avoid acknowledging my existence. A few minutes later, at the checkout line, I bumped into the youth director, a man whose community grant proposals I had personally edited and restructured for free. He looked right through me. His gaze slid over my face with a cold, condemning finality. He looked away, as if maintaining eye contact with me for too long would infect him with my alleged toxicity. It was not just the passing acquaintances. Women I considered genuine friends suddenly stopped returning my text messages. Coffee dates were abruptly canceled with flimsy, transparent excuses about busy schedules. I was entirely cut off from the social infrastructure I had relied on to build my civilian life. Vivian had orchestrated a total social quarantine. She wanted me to feel claustrophobic panic of being completely alone in a major city. She wanted me to realize that my reputation was entirely dependent on her goodwill, and she had just revoked it. She calculated that the sheer embarrassment of being a social pariah would break me. She expected me to crumble under the weight of the community's judgment, pick up the phone, and beg Terrence for a settlement just to make the public humiliation stop. If I were the naive civilian they believed me to be, the strategy would have worked flawlessly. A normal woman would have spent her nights crying on the couch, mourning the unfair loss of her friends. A normal woman would have internalized the shame and tried to publicly defend herself against the gossip feeding right into their narrative that she was erratic and defensive. But I was not a civilian. I recognized Vivian's social quarantine for exactly what it was. It was a textbook psychological operations tactic. You isolate the target. You sever their supply lines. You turn their environment hostile. You demoralize them until the psychological pressure forces an unconditional surrender. Vivian fundamentally misunderstood the nature of her target. I did not fear isolation. In the military, isolation is often the operational baseline. I had spent months stationed in hostile remote territories where trust was a liability and silence was a survival mechanism. Being ignored in an upscale grocery store was not going to break my spirit. Losing the approval of women who folded at the first sign of gossip was not a tragedy. It was a highly efficient filtration system. Every time a church member turned their back on me, I did not feel sorrow. I felt a cold, sharpening focus. The social ostracization stripped away all my civilian obligations. I no longer had to bake pies. I no longer had to host Sunday dinners. I no longer had to pretend to be a docile, agreeable freelancer. Vivian had unintentionally handed me the greatest gift a federal investigator could ask for. She had given me uninterrupted time. I let them have the social circuit. I let Vivian hold court in the church lobby. I let Terence play the wounded martyr for his wealthy friends. I did not defend myself to people committed to misunderstanding me. I simply went back to my quiet, empty house, locked the doors, and closed the blinds. While Vivian was busy spinning her web of lies to secure the congregation's sympathy, she was leaving her digital flank completely exposed. She thought she was winning the war of public opinion. She did not realize that I did not need the approval of the church board to destroy her. I needed actionable intelligence, and their arrogant, noisy distraction was giving me exactly the cover I needed to go to work. I sat down at my desk, opened my encrypted federal terminal, and began to follow the money. I was 3 hours deep into the encrypted routing logs, mapping the exact digital path Terence used to funnel my money into Chloe's fraudulent wellness company, when the aggressive screech of tires violently broke the silence of my home. I minimized my federal terminal screens, locked my workstation, and walked to the front window. A white luxury convertible was parked diagonally across my driveway, its front wheels resting aggressively on my manicured lawn. Chloe threw open the driver's side door and marched toward my porch. She was not dressed in her usual pristine activewear. Her hair was deliberately disheveled, her mascara was slightly smudged, and she wore an oversized sweater that swallowed her frame. It was a meticulously crafted costume of distress. She began pounding on my heavy oak front door with both fists. The rhythmic, frantic thudding echoed through the foyer. "Open the door, Jada!" Chloe screamed, her voice pitched unnaturally high. "Open this door right now! You cannot keep doing this to us!" I did not immediately open the door. I walked to the security panel in my hallway and checked the live feed from my exterior cameras. When I purchased this home, I had a military-grade security system installed. The cameras were discreet, embedded into the architectural trim of the porch, providing overlapping fields of view in high-definition 4K resolution, complete with crystal-clear audio recording. I verified that all sensors were active and recording to my local encrypted server. Only then did I unlock the deadbolt and open the door. I did not step outside. I stood in the threshold, my posture relaxed, my hands visible and resting at my sides. Chloe stood at the bottom of the porch steps staring up at me. The moment the door opened, she amplified her performance. She clutched her chest and began to hyperventilate. "How could you?" Chloe shrieked, ensuring her voice carried across the quiet, affluent street. My next-door neighbor, a retired judge, opened his front blinds. The woman across the street paused her gardening to stare. Chloe was playing to the audience she had specifically driven here to capture. "How could you steal from your own husband?" Chloe wailed, tears streaming down her face. "Terence is falling apart because of you. You are hiding his money, you are locking him out of his own house, and you are trying to ruin my business because you are so bitterly jealous of our family." I looked at her. I did not blink. I did not cross my arms. I did not raise my voice. I understood exactly what this operation was. This was a provocation tactic. Vivian had sent her here to solicit a reaction. They wanted the angry black woman. They wanted me to march down those stairs, wave my hands, and shout in my own defense. They wanted me to lose my temper so Chloe could cower in fear, creating a public spectacle that validated every lie Vivian was spreading at their church. "You need to leave my property, Chloe," I said softly. My voice was completely flat, devoid of any emotional currency she could spend. She hated that. The lack of reaction infuriated her. She took 2 steps up the porch stairs, invading my physical space, her face twisted in genuine malice beneath the theatrical tears. "You are a monster, Jada," she spat, dropping the volume so only I could hear the venom. "You are nothing but a dried-up, controlling freelancer who thought she could buy her way into a real family. Terrence never loved you. You were just an ATM, and now you are a broke, lonely joke." She waited for the explosion. She waited for me to step forward and push her off my porch. I simply looked at the top corner of the porch ceiling, directly at the lens of my primary camera, and then looked back at her. "You have 90 seconds to remove your vehicle from my lawn before I have it towed for trespassing," I stated calmly. Chloe realized she was not going to get the physical altercation she needed, so she improvised. She stumbled backward down the stairs, dramatically catching herself on the railing as if I had shoved her. She threw her hands over her face and let out a blood-curdling, terrified scream that echoed down the entire block. "Do not touch me!" she shrieked, backing away toward her car like a hunted prey. "Stop threatening me. I just wanted to talk. Please do not hurt me." I was standing 10 feet away from her, my feet planted firmly inside my own house. I watched her scramble into her convertible, sobbing hysterically for the benefit of the neighbors, peering through their windows. She threw the car into reverse, tore up a chunk of my grass, and sped down the street. I closed the door, locked the deadbolt, and immediately downloaded the security footage to a secure flash drive. I knew exactly where she was going next. 4 hours later, the doorbell rang. I opened the door to find 2 uniformed Atlanta police officers standing on my porch. They looked tense, their hands resting cautiously near their utility belts. They had clearly been briefed to expect a volatile, aggressive suspect. "Ma'am, are you Jada Henderson?" the older officer asked, his tone brisk and authoritative. "I am," I replied calmly, stepping back so they could see I was entirely unthreatening. "We need you to step outside, please. We are here to serve you with a temporary protective order, and we need to ask you some questions about an incident that occurred here earlier today." I stepped onto the porch and accepted the thick stack of legal paperwork the officer handed me. I glanced at the front page. It was an ex parte temporary restraining order granted by a magistrate judge. Chloe had driven straight from my driveway to the precinct. The younger officer stepped forward, his hand resting on his radio. "We took a report from a Miss Chloe Vance this afternoon. She came into the precinct highly distressed. She stated that she came to your residence to retrieve personal property belonging to your husband and that you became violently erratic. She reported that you verbally assaulted her, physically backed her into a railing, and threatened to do her bodily harm if she ever returned." I looked at the officers. I understood the immense, dangerous weight of this moment. Chloe had weaponized her white tears and her manufactured fragility against a black woman in the Deep South. She had walked into a police station, cried on cue, and leveraged the deeply ingrained societal reflex to protect her at my expense. She expected the police to show up at my house, treat me like a violent criminal, and perhaps even arrest me on the spot for simple assault. She wanted this restraining order to establish a documented history of my supposed aggression, securing Terrence the ultimate advantage in the divorce and the embezzlement lawsuit. "Did she sign a sworn statement to that effect?" I asked, my voice remaining remarkably steady and polite. "She did," the older officer confirmed, his eyes narrowing slightly at my lack of visible panic. "And based on that sworn statement, the judge granted the emergency order. You are to have 0 contact with Miss Vance or her business entities. If you violate this order, you will be arrested. Do you understand?" "I understand perfectly, officer. May I have the incident report number for my legal counsel?" The younger officer handed me a business card with a scribbled number on the back. "Look, ma'am," he said, his tone softening slightly, perhaps confused by my polite corporate demeanor. "Divorces get messy. But you cannot go around physically threatening your husband's family. You need to keep your distance." "I appreciate your time, officers," I said, looking directly into their eyes. "I assure you I will comply entirely with the conditions of this order. Have a safe shift. I closed the door. I walked back to my dining room table and set the restraining order down next to Terrence's fabricated embezzlement lawsuit. Chloe thought she had just delivered the fatal blow. She thought her tears had successfully manipulated the justice system into labeling me a violent aggressor. She thought the sworn police report was her ultimate shield. She had no idea that filing a false police report is a crime. She had no idea that lying to a magistrate judge to secure a restraining order is perjury. She had no idea that swearing a false statement under penalty of law, when there is high-definition time-stamped video and audio evidence proving the exact opposite, is a fast track to a criminal indictment. I did not call a defense attorney. I did not call the police station to argue my side of the story. I simply added the restraining order and the police report number to my growing federal dossier. I let Chloe commit completely to the lie. I let her lock herself inside a perjury trap of her own making. I would not show the security footage to a couple of patrol officers on my porch. I was saving that footage for a federal judge. The silence in my house became my greatest weapon. For the first 48 hours after Chloe filed her fabricated police report, my phone did not stop ringing. Terrence's attorney flooded my inbox with aggressive emails demanding I sign a settlement agreement, threatening to schedule an emergency hearing to force the sale of my house. Vivian's church cronies drove past my property at a crawl, craning their necks to see if I was pacing the front lawn or crying in the windows. They were all waiting for the explosion. They were waiting for the angry, unhinged black woman to finally crack under the immense social and legal pressure they had engineered. I gave them absolutely nothing. I did not yell. I did not cry. I did not call Terrence to beg for my marriage or my money. I went completely dark. I deactivated my civilian social media accounts. I placed my personal cell phone on silent and tossed it into a desk drawer. I drew the heavy linen curtains across every window on the ground floor of my home. To the outside world, I was a defeated, humiliated woman hiding in shame, crushed under the weight of her husband's departure and her community's rejection. I let them believe they had broken my spirit. I let them celebrate their flawless victory. Inside the house, a completely different reality was unfolding. The submissive, accommodating civilian wife they had spent 3 years mocking was dead. I shed that persona like a heavy, suffocating coat. I walked into my dining room, rolled up the sleeves of my blouse, and began clearing the large oak table. I removed the decorative centerpieces, the placemats, and the fine china I had used to serve Vivian her lavish Sunday dinners. I replaced them with the tools of my actual trade. I carried down my heavy-duty encrypted federal laptops. I set up 3 high-resolution monitors. I brought out 2 freestanding whiteboards and a stack of color-coded legal folders. I transformed my formal dining room into a tactical command center. The air in the house shifted from the quiet sorrow of a broken home to the cold, electrified atmosphere of a military war room. My prosecutor instincts, dormant but never gone, flared to life with terrifying clarity. In a civilian divorce, when a spouse drains a bank account, you have to hire a family lawyer, file a motion for discovery, wait months for a judge to issue a subpoena, and pray the opposing counsel complies. But I was not fighting a civilian divorce. I was operating under the parameters of a federal financial crime. The $150,000 Terrence stole was not just generic household savings. It was the direct, heavily documented payout from a classified Department of Defense risk assessment contract. By illegally transferring funds originating from a federal defense disbursement, Terrence had unwittingly elevated his domestic theft into a matter of federal interest. I sat down at my primary terminal and placed my thumb on the biometric scanner. The system verified my identity, clearing me through dual-factor authentication. I entered the secured portal connecting my consultancy to the federal network. I was not going to rely on the sluggish local family courts to track my stolen money. I was going to use the full crushing weight of the federal government. I picked up my encrypted satellite phone. I did not call a local divorce attorney. I dialed a secured line in Washington, D.C., reaching out directly to Special Agent Sterling. Sterling and I had served together in Afghanistan during my time in the Judge Advocate General Corps. He was a brilliant, relentless forensic accountant who now ran a specialized financial crimes unit for the FBI. I had once saved his career by exposing a corrupt contracting ring that was trying to frame his unit for missing operational funds. He owed me a debt he swore he would repay whenever I called. I was finally calling to collect. Colonel Sterling answered, his voice sharp and alert. The military honorific felt like a jolt of electricity. It had been years since someone addressed me by my rank. It was a stark reminder of exactly who I was. "I need a favor, Sterling," I said, my voice perfectly level, stripping away any trace of civilian vulnerability. "I have a domestic situation that has escalated into a federal wire fraud incident. A civilian target has unlawfully accessed my personal accounts and initiated a series of unauthorized wire transfers totaling $150,000. The funds originated from my current DoD contract disbursements." There was a brief pause on the line. I heard the clack of a keyboard as Sterling immediately pulled up a secure terminal on his end. "You are telling me someone was stupid enough to steal federal contract payouts from a former JAG prosecutor?" "That is exactly what I am telling you," I replied. "They used a joint checking account as a pass-through and routed the capital to an external corporate entity. I need to bypass the local discovery process. I need you to initiate a quiet preliminary trace through the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. I need the digital exhaust. I want the IP addresses of the originating transfers, the routing numbers of the destination accounts, and the corporate registry data for the receiving shell company." "Consider it done," Colonel Sterling said, his tone shifting into absolute professional efficiency. "Give me the originating account number and a 48-hour window. I will pull the FinCEN routing logs and send them to your encrypted server. Do we need to alert the local authorities?" "No," I instructed firmly. "The local authorities are currently compromised by a false police report filed by a co-conspirator. I am building a comprehensive federal dossier. I will present the evidence on my timeline. Keep this inquiry completely off the radar." I hung up the phone and looked at my blank whiteboards. The trap Vivian and Terrence thought they had set for me was actually a remarkably sloppy, arrogant series of financial blunders. They had operated with the sloppy confidence of people who had never faced real consequences. They assumed that moving money through a banking app and setting up a basic limited liability company was enough to hide their tracks from a freelance administrative assistant. They did not understand that modern money laundering leaves an undeniable digital exhaust. Every time you log into a banking portal, your device leaves an IP signature. Every time you authorize a wire transfer across state lines, it pings a federal clearinghouse. Every time you register a business to receive stolen funds, you link your social security number to a criminal enterprise. I began mapping out the primary targets on the whiteboard. Terrence at the center, the arrogant executor of the theft. Chloe on the right, the willing recipient and operator of the fraudulent shell company. And Vivian at the top, the matriarch directing the strategic movement of the family wealth. For the next 2 days, I did not sleep in my bed. I slept in a chair in the dining room waiting for the secure data drop from Sterling. I drank black coffee and reviewed the state business registries mapping out the corporate structure of Chloe's new holistic wellness brand. It was a paper-thin illusion. The company had no commercial lease, no registered inventory, and no legitimate business plan. It existed solely to receive the capital Terrence had siphoned from my accounts. When the encrypted file from the FBI finally landed on my secure server, I opened the routing logs. The data was beautifully, devastatingly precise. Sterling had pulled the exact digital footprints of the theft. I traced the data line by line. The IP address logged for the initial transfer from my savings account did not originate from Terrence's office or his mobile phone. It originated from the secure Wi-Fi network at Vivian's estate. Terrence had not just stolen the money in a moment of desperate panic. He had sat in his mother's house, likely with her watching over his shoulder, and executed the transfer from her network. I wrote the IP address on the whiteboard and drew a thick red line connecting Terrence directly to Vivian. They were entirely wrapped up in this conspiracy together. They had operated in the shadows, assuming my silence was proof of my ignorance. They had no idea that while they were busy celebrating my demise, I was standing in a war room quietly loading the ammunition that would destroy their entire legacy. I stepped back from the whiteboard and picked up my stylus. The red line connecting Terrence to Vivian was just the beginning of the infection. I needed to see exactly how far the rot spread. The initial transfer of my life savings had hit our joint checking account, but it only rested there for exactly 14 minutes. From there, the funds were broken into 4 distinct smaller transactions, all hovering just below the federal reporting threshold to avoid triggering automatic bank alerts. Terrence thought he was being clever, employing a basic structuring technique known as smurfing. It is a rookie move, the kind of financial maneuver that might fool a sleepy local bank teller, but looks like a blazing neon sign to a federal investigator. I did not waste my time sending subpoenas to the local branch where the joint account was held. Civilian bank managers move at a glacial pace and only see the surface layer of a transaction. Instead, I opened the secondary dataset Sterling had provided. I bypassed the consumer-facing ledgers and dove straight into the federal routing network. The Fedwire system does not lie. It strips away the user-friendly interface of a banking app and exposes the raw, alphanumeric skeleton of every financial movement. I isolated the unique transaction identifiers for Terrence's 4 outbound wires. I began to follow the money down the rabbit hole. The funds did not just go straight into a simple business checking account for Chloe's fake wellness startup. That would have been too straightforward. Vivian had clearly coached them on how to obscure capital. The money was routed into a labyrinth of interconnected limited liability companies. I pulled the state incorporation records for each destination account. The first wire hit holding company registered under the name Zenith Logistics. The second went to a consulting firm called Apex Strategies. The third and fourth were funneled into vendors specializing in holistic lifestyle branding and premium organic supply chain management. On paper, it looked like a legitimate corporate ecosystem. To a civilian divorce attorney, this would look like Terrence was simply paying normal business expenses and funding his sister's vendor network. But I was not a civilian attorney looking at a balance sheet. I was a forensic specialist looking at a laundering syndicate. I cross-referenced the registered agents for each of these companies. Every single one of them traced back to Chloe. She was listed as the managing member, the registered agent, or the sole proprietor. The addresses for these supposed corporate headquarters were not commercial offices. They were virtual mailboxes and abandoned strip mall suites located in neighboring counties. I dug into the operational history of the wellness vendors Chloe had established. They were entirely hollow. There were no payroll records, no commercial leases, and no inventory purchase orders. She had created a phantom supply chain. She was generating fake invoices from Zenith Logistics to her wellness brand, authorizing the payment with her own signature, and moving the stolen money from one pocket to the other. She was washing my life savings through a washing machine made of fabricated invoices for non-existent organic yoga mats and fictional holistic retreats. The arrogance of their operation was almost insulting. They had wrapped their theft in the trendy, unassailable language of female entrepreneurship and minority-owned business development. They assumed that if anyone ever questioned the flow of capital, they could just throw out a few buzzwords about building generational wealth and funding a marginalized startup, and the inquiries would stop. They relied on the social conditioning that protected wealthy, prominent families from genuine scrutiny. I zoomed in on the digital authorization signatures attached to the federal wire transfers. This was the critical vulnerability in their operation. When you move money through corporate accounts, somebody has to legally authorize the release of funds. Terrence had initiated the first jump from our joint account, but the subsequent movements within the shell companies required dual authorization to clear the commercial banking protocols. I pulled the digital signature logs from the Fedwire data. The primary authorization belonged to Chloe as expected, but the secondary authorization signature, the one required to clear the funds through the corporate holding accounts, did not belong to Terrence. I stared at the high-resolution scan of the digital signature block on my monitor. It belonged to Vivian. My mother-in-law was not just sitting on the sidelines offering bad financial advice. She was an active, authorized signatory on the fraudulent shell companies Chloe had set up to launder my money. Vivian had legally bound herself to the conspiracy. She had used her immaculate, pristine reputation to secure the banking profiles for these fake corporate entities. She had leveraged her excellent credit score and her unassailable community standing to bypass the bank's standard fraud prevention algorithms. No bank manager was going to flag an account opened by a prominent church trustee and wealthy socialite. Vivian had provided the institutional cover for her stepdaughter and her son to commit grand larceny. I sat in the glow of my monitors, the magnitude of their stupidity washing over me. They truly believed they were criminal masterminds. They thought they had constructed an impenetrable fortress of corporate jargon. They had no idea they had meticulously documented a coordinated conspiracy to commit wire fraud, leaving an undeniable digital trail that led straight to the matriarch of the family. I took my red marker and began drawing connecting lines across the whiteboard, linking the virtual mailboxes, the fake vendor invoices, and the digital signatures. I wrote down the exact dollar amounts next to each routing jump. The web expanded, covering the entire board in a dense, undeniable matrix of financial crimes. It was a beautiful, devastating picture of their guilt. As I stepped back to survey the completed diagram, a chilling realization took hold. The infrastructure they had built was too elaborate, too established, for a single theft of $150,000. You do not set up 4 distinct shell companies, secure virtual addresses, and establish dual authorization, commercial banking profiles, just to steal from your daughter-in-law on a whim. This network was highly premeditated. It was a well-oiled machine that had clearly been functioning long before I married into the family. They had not built this labyrinth just for me. My money was simply the latest deposit into a system that had been running for a very long time. Terrence's constant business failures, Chloe's endless string of abandoned startups, Vivian's aggressive control over the family finances, all of it was a cover for a continuous systemic laundering operation. They were draining money from somewhere else, pumping it through Chloe's fake companies, and using it to fund their opulent lifestyle while claiming to be successful entrepreneurs. I turned back to my terminal, my heart beating with the cold, measured rhythm of a hunter who had just spotted the rest of the pack. I needed to see exactly how far back this fraud went. I needed to find the original source of the capital they were washing through these shell accounts. If they were brazen enough to steal from a federal contractor, there was no telling who else they were defrauding. I opened a new encrypted search parameter and prepared to dig into the one place Vivian thought was completely untouchable. The one place Vivian believed was completely untouchable was Greater Fellowship Tabernacle. She wielded her position on the executive board of trustees like a royal scepter. The church was a sprawling 10,000-member congregation that generated millions of dollars annually in tithes, offerings, and community outreach donations. Vivian controlled the women's ministry and oversaw the charitable disbursement funds. I had previously helped the church organize local food drives and audited their minor community outreach programs for free, but I had never been granted access to the executive operational fund. That ledger was fiercely guarded by Vivian and a select few legacy board members. It was her private kingdom. I opened a new secure browser window and navigated to the Internal Revenue Service public database. While religious institutions have distinct tax reporting exemptions, Greater Fellowship Tabernacle operated a registered 501c3 nonprofit arm for its community development and housing initiatives. Those tax returns, known as Form 990s, are public record. Large nonprofits are legally required to disclose their highest compensated independent contractors and detail major vendor disbursements. I pulled the church's tax filings for the past 5 years, downloaded the dense PDF documents, and uploaded them into my forensic analysis software. I ran a cross-referencing algorithm, matching the church's declared vendor list against the labyrinth of shell companies Chloe had established. The system took less than 30 seconds to find a match. The screen lit up with dozens of highlighted data points. Zenith Logistics, Apex Strategies, Horizon Holistic Wellness. The church had been paying Chloe's fake companies astronomical sums. I read the line items, my jaw tightening with every documented transfer. The nonprofit arm of the church had disbursed hundreds of thousands of dollars annually to Chloe's entities. The stated purposes for these payments were vaguely categorized as community wellness consulting event, logistical support, and spiritual retreat management. There were no retreats. There was no logistical support. Chloe had never worked a day in her life for that congregation. I took a deep breath, steadying my hands on the keyboard. I needed to verify the incoming flow using the federal data Sterling had provided. I pulled the Fedwire logs again, filtering the parameters to show all inbound traffic to Chloe's holding accounts over a 5-year period. The results were staggering. It was a constant heavy stream of capital flowing straight from the church's operational accounts into Chloe's pockets. We were not looking at a few missing thousands. We were looking at a highly coordinated multi-million-dollar embezzlement operation. Over the course of 5 years, they had siphoned over $3.2 million from the congregation. But a laundering syndicate requires a closed loop. Chloe was receiving the stolen church funds, but how was Terrence getting his cut? I highlighted Chloe's outbound transfers to find the final destination of the washed money. The stolen capital did not sit in Chloe's accounts. She took a flat 10% cut, likely her fee for maintaining the corporate fronts and paying the minimal taxes required to keep the LLCs active. The remaining 90% of the funds were systematically wired to a commercial real estate holding group registered in Delaware. I ran the corporate registry for the Delaware Holding Group. Delaware is notoriously secretive regarding corporate ownership, but federal clearance bypasses those state-level privacy shields. I pulled the unredacted incorporation documents. The registered agent and sole beneficiary of the holding group was Terrence. The mechanics of the fraud were brilliantly ruthless and completely devastating. It was a perfectly enclosed familial laundering syndicate. Vivian abused her unchecked authority on the church board to approve massive fraudulent vendor payouts from the charity fund. She was stealing directly from the collection plates of working-class families who trusted her with their spiritual and financial sacrifices. Chloe provided the necessary illusion of legitimacy by issuing fake invoices through her wellness startups, washing the stolen money to make it look like a standard commercial business expense. Chloe then funneled the clean laundered money to Terrence's fake real estate and logistics companies under the guise of commercial investments. Terrence then used that clean money to fund his flashy millionaire lifestyle, pay for his custom suits, lease his luxury SUVs, and purchase the designer clothes Vivian wore to church every Sunday. They were financing their opulent, untouchable social dynasty with the stolen tithes of their own congregation. A sudden sharp realization hit me. If they had a $3 million racket running smoothly for 5 years, why did Terrence need to steal my $150,000? Why risk exposing a massive federal crime ring for a relatively small domestic theft? I looked back at the church's recent public filings and matched them against the local news archives. 2 months ago, Greater Fellowship Tabernacle had announced a massive expansion project to build a new community center. To secure the commercial construction loans, the bank required an independent third-party audit of the church's finances. Vivian had been forced to temporarily freeze her illicit disbursements to Chloe's shell companies to ensure the books looked clean for the impending bank audit. The laundering machine had been paused. Terrence's fake businesses were suddenly starved of their monthly injection of stolen cash. He had outstanding commercial leases, luxury car payments, and country club dues coming up. His lifestyle required a massive amount of liquid capital to maintain the illusion of success. He panicked. Instead of downsizing his spending or explaining the cash flow issue, he looked at his wife's heavily funded primary savings account. He stole from me to bridge the gap until the church audit was completed and Vivian could turn the laundering machine back on. My hard-earned money was just a temporary patch to keep his fraudulent empire afloat. The sheer magnitude of their criminality was almost difficult to process. We were no longer dealing with a bitter domestic dispute or a petty divorce strategy. This was a violation of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. The RICO Act was specifically designed to take down organized criminal enterprises that commit wire fraud, money laundering, and embezzlement. They had crossed every single federal line in the financial code. I leaned back in my dining room chair, surrounded by the glow of my monitors. The betrayal of my marriage felt entirely insignificant compared to the monstrous betrayal of those thousands of church members. Vivian had stood at the pulpit smiling and praying while systematically robbing the community that revered her. Terrence had paraded around as a self-made visionary black businessman when in reality he was a parasitic thief living off stolen charity funds. Chloe had weaponized her tears against me while happily acting as the primary mule for a multi-million-dollar fraud ring. The anger I felt was no longer hot or volatile. It was absolute freezing and infinitely patient. They filed a frivolous, aggressive lawsuit against me because they wanted me panicked. They wanted me destitute. They thought I would be so terrified of losing my local reputation and my premarital home that I would blindly sign whatever settlement they put in front of me just to make the public embarrassment stop. They wanted me to grovel. They wanted to break me so thoroughly that I would never have the strength to look into their finances. I began compiling every single document into a master file. I saved the unredacted Delaware Incorporation papers. I saved the Fedwire routing logs. I saved the fake Zenith Logistics invoices. I saved the church's Form 990 tax returns. I organized the data with the meticulous, lethal precision of a military prosecutor preparing a death blow. I encrypted the master file and backed it up to 3 separate secure federal servers. I did not need a divorce attorney. I did not need to issue a single civilian subpoena. I had the entire federal government's financial tracking system at my disposal, and I had just mapped out a criminal indictment that would put all 3 of them in federal prison for decades. I walked over to the dining room table and opened my black leather briefcase. I printed out the essential, undeniable ledgers that proved the wire fraud. I placed the documents into perfectly organized manila folders. I slid those folders into the briefcase and snapped the brass locks shut. The trap was fully set. I just had to walk into that courtroom and let them spring it on themselves. The word prosecution hung in the air like a fired bullet. Judge Harrison leaned back in his leather chair, a knowing glint in his eye. He understood exactly what I was doing. In a civil divorce and asset dispute, there is no prosecution. There is a petitioner and a respondent. By referring to myself as the prosecution, I was signaling to the judge that this was no longer a family court matter. This was an indictment. Terrence's attorney, a slick man in a $1,000 suit, whose name was Mr. Caldwell, practically scrambled over his own feet to stand up. He grabbed the edges of his podium, his knuckles turning white as he desperately tried to regain control of the room. He cleared his throat loudly, attempting to dismiss the judge's greeting as some sort of inside joke or a meaningless pleasantry he simply did not understand. "Your Honor," Caldwell began, his voice projecting the booming theatrical confidence of a man used to bullying unrepresented wives. "If we could direct our attention to the matter at hand. We are here today on an emergency motion for a preliminary injunction. My client is seeking immediate relief from the respondent's ongoing financial sabotage. We have presented a comprehensive complaint detailing gross corporate embezzlement." Judge Harrison held up a hand. The courtroom immediately fell silent. The judge looked at Caldwell, then shifted his gaze back to my empty table. "Before we proceed with any motions, Mr. Caldwell, I need to address the record," Judge Harrison said, his tone authoritative and crisp. "Colonel, I do not see a notice of appearance filed for your defense counsel, who is representing you in this matter today." I stood up. I kept my posture impeccable, resting my hands lightly on the edges of my table. "I am proceeding pro se, Your Honor. I will be representing myself." A sharp barking laugh erupted from Caldwell's side of the room. It was not a polite chuckle. It was a loud theatrical scoff designed to humiliate me in front of the gallery. Caldwell shook his head, looking back at Terrence with a wide, mocking grin. Terrence immediately fed off his lawyer's arrogance. The absolute terror that had gripped him just moments ago vanished. He sat back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest, his ego instantly inflating back to its normal suffocating size. In the gallery behind them, Vivian let out a long, audible sigh of relief. She leaned over to Chloe, whispering loudly enough for her voice to carry across the quiet courtroom. "She cannot even afford a lawyer. I told you she was completely broke. She is going to make an absolute fool of herself." Chloe smirked, pulling out her phone again, undoubtedly preparing to text her friends about the pathetic spectacle unfolding in front of her. They had completely disregarded the judge calling me Colonel. In their arrogance, they had likely rationalized it as a nickname, an honorary title from a local charity, or simply a mistake. They only heard what they wanted to hear. They heard that the quiet, submissive freelancer was attempting to navigate a high-stakes financial lawsuit without a legal team to protect her. Your Honor, Caldwell said, his voice dripping with weaponized condescension. I must object to the respondent proceeding pro se in a case of this magnitude. We are dealing with highly complex allegations of corporate embezzlement, breach of fiduciary duty, and sophisticated financial sabotage. This is not a simple traffic dispute. The respondent is a freelance administrative assistant. She lacks the legal acumen to understand the discovery process, let alone the intricate financial ledgers we have submitted into evidence. Allowing her to represent herself will only result in a severe waste of this court's valuable time. He turned slightly, angling his body so he could look down his nose at me. With all due respect to the respondent, she is entirely out of her depth. My client simply wants to secure his business assets and finalize this divorce without being bogged down by the procedural errors of an amateur. I did not flinch. I did not glare at him. I simply waited for him to finish his little performance. When he finally stopped talking, I looked directly at Judge Harrison. The judge was resting his chin on his hand, looking at Caldwell with an expression of profound, almost painful pity. The judge knew my record. He knew exactly how many federal convictions I had secured during my tenure at the Judge Advocate General Corps. I knew I had prosecuted international defense contractors for fraud schemes that made Terrence's fake logistics company look like a lemonade stand. Your Honor, I said, my voice cutting through the room with calm, lethal precision. I am fully aware of the allegations presented in the petitioner's complaint. I am intimately familiar with the rules of evidence, the Georgia Civil Practice Act, and the specific statutes regarding corporate fiduciary duty. Furthermore, I have already reviewed the financial ledgers Mr. Caldwell is referring to. I assure the court there will be no procedural delays on my end. I am prepared to address every single claim right here, right now. Caldwell let out another dismissive scoff. Your Honor, reviewing a ledger and understanding forensic accounting are two entirely different things. My client has provided certified business statements. I will allow the respondent to proceed pro se. Judge Harrison interrupted, his voice cracking like a whip. Mr. Caldwell, I strongly advise you to focus on the substance of your arguments rather than the qualifications of the opposing party. You might find that underestimating the individual sitting across from you is a critical error in judgment. Caldwell's jaw tightened. He did not like being reprimanded, but his monumental ego prevented him from actually hearing the judge's warning. He buttoned his suit jacket and puffed out his chest, stepping out from behind his table. Very well, Your Honor, Caldwell said smoothly, shifting instantly into attack mode. If the respondent insists on representing herself, we are prepared to move forward. We have submitted Exhibit A, which contains the audited bank statements from my client's logistics company. These documents clearly demonstrate a pattern of unauthorized withdrawals initiated by the respondent. She systematically drained my client's operating capital, forcing his business into insolvency. Caldwell strutted back and forth, playing to Vivian and Chloe in the gallery. He painted a masterful, tragic picture of Terrence as a visionary entrepreneur who was mercilessly financially abused by a jealous, spiteful wife. He described my independent consultancy as a sham, a hollow shell. I used to hide the money I was stealing from his hard-working client. It was the exact narrative Vivian had been spreading at their megachurch, polished and packaged for a courtroom setting. We are requesting an immediate emergency injunction, Caldwell concluded, pointing a dramatic finger in my direction. We ask the court to freeze all of the respondent's personal accounts and place a lien on her primary residence. We must prevent her from moving the stolen capital offshore before a full forensic audit can be completed. He walked back to his table and sat down, shooting a triumphant look at Terrence. Terrence nodded approvingly. Vivian sat up straighter, a proud, vindicated smile spreading across her face. They thought they had delivered the knockout blow. They thought the sheer volume of their accusations and the intimidating legal terminology had backed me into a corner from which I could never escape. Judge Harrison looked down at the paperwork in front of him, then looked over at me. Colonel, he said quietly, the petitioner has submitted their financial ledgers into evidence. Do you have a response to these allegations? I reached down and unclasped the brass locks on my black leather briefcase. The sharp metallic click echoed loudly in the quiet room. I opened the lid. I did not pull out a scribbled notepad or a handful of printed emails. I pulled out 3 perfectly bound, color-coded, heavily indexed evidentiary binders. I placed them deliberately on the wooden table in front of me. "I certainly do, Your Honor," I replied. I slid the first heavy binder across the polished wood of my table to the bailiff, who carried it up to the bench. I handed a second identical binder to Mr. Caldwell. He snatched it from my hands, his eyes darting over the thick, color-coded tabs with sudden, undisguised apprehension. The sheer weight of the binder hitting his table sent a very clear message. This was not a hastily assembled defense from a panicked housewife. Judge Harrison opened the cover of my binder, adjusted his glasses, and scanned the index. A profound silence fell over the room as he turned the first few pages. I watched the line of his jaw tighten. He looked up, his expression unreadable, and nodded to Terrence's attorney. "You may call your first witness, Mr. Caldwell," the judge instructed. Caldwell stood, straightening his jacket to project a confidence he was rapidly losing. "The defense calls Terrence Vance to the stand." Terrence stood up from his chair, buttoning his custom suit. He walked to the witness stand with that familiar, arrogant swagger he always deployed when he felt the room belonged to him. He placed his left hand on the Bible, raised his right hand, and swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. He sat down, adjusted the microphone, and shot a quick, reassuring smile toward Vivian and Chloe in the gallery. Caldwell approached the podium. He walked Terrence through a series of highly rehearsed questions designed to paint a masterpiece of victimhood. Terrence played his part flawlessly. He adopted a somber, wounded tone. He testified that he was a hard-working entrepreneur trying to build a legacy for his community. He testified that he had trusted his wife implicitly with his corporate finances. Then Caldwell handed Terrence a copy of their Exhibit A, the fabricated financial ledgers they had submitted to the court. "Mr. Vance," Caldwell prompted gently, "can you identify this document for the court?" Terrence held the paperwork up. "These are the official operating ledgers for my logistics company. They detail the exact capital that my wife Jada systematically embezzled from my accounts over the past 6 months to fund her secret lifestyle." "And you personally reviewed these documents?" Caldwell asked. "I did," Terrence stated firmly, looking directly at the judge. "I went through them line by line when I realized my business was failing because of her theft. Every single entry is true and accurate." Caldwell smiled, turning back to his table. "No further questions, Your Honor." Judge Harrison looked at me. "Colonel, you may cross-examine the witness." I stood up. I did not rush. I took my time walking to the podium. I did not bring any notes with me. I did not need them. I had memorized every single fabricated number, every false date, and every forged signature in their complaint. I stood at the center of the courtroom, resting my hands lightly on the edges of the podium, and looked directly into Terrence's eyes. The arrogant smirk on his face faltered just a fraction. Up until this exact second, he had never faced me in a professional capacity. He had only ever argued with a wife trying to save her marriage. He was about to experience the cross-examination of a federal prosecutor. "Mr. Vance." I began, my voice calm, polite, and completely devoid of any domestic familiarity. "You just testified under oath that the ledgers in Exhibit A are the true, accurate, and official records of your commercial business accounts. Is that correct?" "Yes, it is," Terrence replied, puffing out his chest. "And you testified that you personally reviewed these documents line by line. You are certain there are no errors, alterations, or omissions in this exhibit?" "Objection," Caldwell interrupted, standing up quickly. "Asked and answered. My client has already authenticated the documents." "Overruled," Judge Harrison snapped without looking away from Terrence. "The witness will answer the question." Terrence shifted his weight in the witness chair. "I reviewed them," he said, his voice losing a fraction of its booming resonance. "They are accurate." "Excellent," I replied smoothly. "Please direct your attention to page 14 of your exhibit." Terrence flipped through the pages. Vivian leaned forward in the gallery, her posture rigid, sensing the trap, but powerless to stop it. "On page 14, there is a recorded withdrawal of $25,000 dated November 24th, I stated, reciting the ledger perfectly from memory. "You claim in your sworn affidavit that I executed this transfer to sabotage your fleet operations." That is correct, Terrence said, gripping the edges of the witness stand. You moved the money without my authorization. I see, I replied, tilting my head slightly. Mr. Vance, what day of the week was November 24th of last year? Terrence frowned. I do not have a calendar in front of me. It does not matter what day it was. The money was taken. It matters immensely, Mr. Vance. I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous icy register. Because November 24th was Thanksgiving Day. I let the silence hang in the courtroom for 3 full seconds. Terrence stared at me, his brow furrowing as he tried to calculate where I was going with this. Mr. Vance, as the chief executive officer of a logistics company, you are surely aware that commercial banks and the Federal Reserve wire system do not process corporate asset transfers on federal holidays. A certified bank ledger would never show an executed cleared wire transfer dated on Thanksgiving Day. It is a functional impossibility. Terrence froze. His eyes darted to Caldwell, who was frantically flipping through his own copy of the exhibit, his face draining of color as he realized the catastrophic clerical error his client had made. It must be a processing delay, Terrence stammered, adjusting his collar, as a thin sheen of sweat broke out on his forehead. The bank probably backdated it. Federal banks do not backdate wire transfers to closed holidays. Mr. Vance, I corrected him sharply, taking a step closer to the podium. Let us move on to page 22. You have listed a vendor payout of $40,000 to a company called Apex Strategies, dated February 2nd. You claim I initiated this transfer to a shell company to hide your capital. Is that your sworn testimony? Terrence swallowed hard. Yes. I looked at him with absolute terrifying pity. Mr. Vance's corporate registry data is public record. Apex Strategies was not legally incorporated with the Secretary of State until February 15th. How exactly did I wire $40,000 to a corporate entity that did not legally exist until 2 weeks later? Objection! Caldwell shouted, practically knocking his chair over as he stood up. The respondent is testifying and introducing unverified corporate data into her questioning. The data is fully verified and indexed in my evidentiary binder on your Honor's desk under tab 4, I stated calmly without looking at Caldwell. Certified copies directly from the Secretary of State. Judge Harrison flipped to tab 4. He reviewed the certified state registry document, then looked up at Terrence. The objection is overruled. The witness will explain the discrepancy. Terrence was visibly crumbling. The tailored suit suddenly looked 2 sizes too big on him. He opened his mouth, stammered a few incomprehensible syllables, and looked back at Vivian in the gallery. Vivian sat completely paralyzed, her hands gripping the wooden bench in front of her. She realized her son was drowning on the stand, being systematically dismantled by the woman she had called a simple administrative assistant. I did not give him time to recover. I hit him again. You stated under oath that these were unaltered official bank records. I continued, my voice carrying the relentless driving rhythm of an interrogation. Yet we have transfers clearing on closed federal holidays and payouts to corporate entities that did not exist. I put it to you, Mr. Vance, that Exhibit A is not a certified bank ledger. It is a fabricated spreadsheet that you personally manufactured on your computer to frame me for your own financial insolvency. I did not manufacture anything. Terrence shouted, his temper finally breaking through his manufactured composure. You are trying to confuse the court with technicalities. I am establishing perjury, Mr. Vance. I countered, my voice echoing off the marble walls. I am establishing that you came into this federal courtroom, raised your right hand, and swore that a fabricated Excel spreadsheet was an official financial document. You did this to secure an emergency injunction against my assets. Terrence gripped the microphone. You took my money. You destroyed my business. I leaned forward over the podium. I locked eyes with him, bringing the full crushing weight of 12 years of military prosecution down onto his fragile ego. I did not destroy your business, Terrence, I said softly, ensuring the microphone picked up every single syllable. Your business never existed, and in exactly 2 minutes I am going to prove to this court exactly where your missing money actually went. I stepped back from the podium. Terrence looked like he was going to be sick. He had just sworn under penalty of perjury that his forged documents were real, locking himself into a federal crime right in front of a judge who had zero tolerance for liars. The trap had slammed shut. Now it was time to drop the hammer. Your Honor, if you would direct your attention to tab 7 of the binder I have provided, I said, my voice cutting through the heavy silence of the courtroom. The documents you are looking at are not generated from a consumer banking application. They are certified subpoenaed Fedwire routing logs, authenticated by the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. Caldwell practically tore his copy of the binder, open his hands trembling as he flipped to the specified tab. The color completely drained from his face. He was looking at a federal paper trail stamped with the official seal of the Department of the Treasury. These logs detail the actual movement of the $150,000. My husband claims I embezzled. I continued pacing slowly across the well of the court. As the court will see on page 42, the funds were initiated from my primary civilian savings account via an IP address registered to the Buckhead estate of Vivian Vance. They were temporarily parked in a joint checking account before being fragmented into 4 separate wire transfers. Judge Harrison traced the lines of data with his pen, his brow furrowed in deep concentration. He flipped the page following the numeric trail exactly as I had laid it out. Those 4 transfers were routed to a holding company named Zenith Logistics. I stated, my gaze locking onto Terrence. From Zenith Logistics, the funds were not used for fleet operations payroll or any legitimate commercial expense. Instead, they were bundled and wired internationally. Your Honor, if you look at the final destination routing number at the bottom of page 45, you will see the capital was deposited into a personal, offshore account held at a private bank in the Cayman Islands. I paused, allowing the gravity of the statement to settle over the room. I turned my body slightly, directing my attention past Terrence and straight into the gallery. That offshore account is registered solely to Chloe Vance, I declared. My husband did not suffer financial ruin at my hands. He actively stole my life savings and laundered it across international borders into his stepsister's private accounts to hide it from this very court. Objection! Caldwell shouted, his voice cracking with sheer panic. He slammed his hand on his table. This is an ambush. These documents were not provided in preliminary discovery. The respondent is introducing unverified federal intelligence to sandbag my client. Judge Harrison looked over his glasses at the defense attorney. The judge's eyes were cold and merciless. Mr. Caldwell, the documents contain a self-authenticating federal seal and a chain of custody affidavit signed by a special agent of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They are admissible under the federal rules of evidence. If you failed to subpoena the actual routing logs and instead relied on your client's fabricated Excel spreadsheets, that is a failure of your own legal diligence. The objection is overruled. Terrence shrank into his chair. He looked like a man who had just stepped on a landmine and heard the click. In the gallery, Vivian had gone entirely rigid. She stared at the back of her son's head, her pristine facade cracking as the realization hit her. I was not just defending myself against an alimony claim. I was laying the groundwork for a federal indictment right in front of a sitting judge. Caldwell was hyperventilating. He knew his career was on the line. He had submitted perjured financial documents to a judge, and he was desperately looking for a way to pivot the narrative and regain control of the room. He decided to play their final dirtiest card. Your Honor! Caldwell stammered, frantically waving his hands. Regardless of these disputed financial movements, we must address the immediate danger my client and his family are facing. The respondent is attempting to deflect from her own violent instability. Just 3 days ago, she physically assaulted my client's sister on her own property. We have an active court-ordered emergency restraining order. The respondent is a highly trained military veteran who presents a severe, documented physical threat to this family. I smiled. It was a small, dangerous smile. I had been waiting for him to bring up the restraining order. I am so glad you brought that up, Mr. Caldwell, I said smoothly. Your Honor, the petitioner's counsel is referring to an ex parte temporary restraining order granted by a local magistrate based entirely on a sworn police report filed by Chloe Vance. I walked over to my briefcase, retrieved a silver USB drive, and handed it to the bailiff. I asked the bailiff to connect it to the courtroom's multimedia system. In that police report which Mr. Caldwell has conveniently attached to his motion for an emergency injunction, Miss Vance swore under penalty of perjury that I verbally assaulted her, backed her into a railing, and physically threatened her life. She claimed she was terrified for her physical safety. The large flat-screen monitors mounted on the courtroom walls flickered to life. I picked up a remote control from the evidence podium. What Miss Vance failed to realize when she weaponized her tears at the local police precinct, I said, projecting my voice so every single person in the gallery could hear me, is that my property is equipped with a military-grade overlapping high-definition security system. I pressed play. The monitors displayed crystal-clear 4K resolution footage of my front yard and porch. The audio was pristine. The entire courtroom watched as Chloe's white luxury convertible aggressively jumped the curb onto my lawn. They watched Chloe march up to my door completely unprovoked and begin pounding on it with her fists. They heard her screaming, demanding I open the door. Then the footage showed the door opening. It showed me standing safely inside the threshold, my hands visible, and at my sides projecting absolute calm. It captured Chloe invading my space, her face contorted with malice. It captured her explicitly threatening me, calling me a dried-up, controlling freelancer. The courtroom echoed with the crisp audio of my single polite warning. You have 90 seconds to remove your vehicle from my lawn before I have it towed for trespassing. Then came the grand finale. The monitors displayed Chloe realizing she was not going to get the violent reaction she wanted. The entire courtroom watched her deliberately stumble backward down the stairs, fake catching herself on the railing, and let out a blood-curdling theatrical scream. They watched her scramble into her car and tear up my grass as she sped away completely unharmed and entirely untouched. I paused the video on a freeze frame of Chloe's fake scream. I turned to look at her in the gallery. Chloe was practically sliding under the wooden bench, her face burning with a humiliating, unmistakable crimson flush. She looked like she wanted the floor to open up and swallow her whole. Your Honor, I said, turning back to Judge Harrison. The video evidence clearly contradicts every single statement made in the police report. Chloe Vance drove to my home to provoke an altercation, failed, and then deliberately lied to law enforcement to secure a fraudulent restraining order. She weaponized the justice system to assassinate my character and assist her brother in this frivolous lawsuit. That is textbook perjury, and it is a criminal offense. Judge Harrison stared at the paused monitor, his face dark with fury. He despised having his court manipulated, and he loathed civilians who thought they could use the law as a plaything. He slowly turned his lethal gaze toward Terrence and his attorney. Mr. Caldwell, Judge Harrison said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet rumble. You have submitted falsified financial ledgers into my court. You have attempted to use a fraudulently obtained restraining order to secure an emergency injunction. You and your client are treading on extraordinarily dangerous ground. Caldwell looked like he was about to pass out. He grabbed the edges of his podium, opening his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The Golden family's illusion of superiority was dead. They had walked into a slaughterhouse, and I had not even shown them the church accounts yet. Your Honor, if I may direct the court's attention to the final section, tab 8, I said. My voice was the only sound in the cavernous room. The silence was absolute, heavy with the impending weight of total destruction. I did not look at Terrence. I did not look at his mother in the gallery. I kept my eyes locked on Judge Harrison. Judge Harrison turned the thick, color-coded pages to the final tab. He adjusted his glasses. What you are looking at, Your Honor, are the publicly filed Form 990 tax returns for the nonprofit community development arm of Greater Fellowship Tabernacle. I explained, projecting my voice so every syllable rang with absolute clarity. Specifically, the disbursement ledgers for the past 5 fiscal years. As the court is well aware, nonprofit entities are legally required to disclose their highest compensated independent contractors. I paused, letting the name of the church settle over the room. Behind me, I heard a sharp, ragged intake of breath. Vivian knew exactly what was in those tax returns. If you look at page 52 of the exhibit, You will see a series of massive vendor payouts authorized by the Executive Board of Trustees, I continued. The sole authorizing signature on every single one of those disbursements belongs to the head of the Women's Ministry and Executive Trustee, Vivian. I finally turned to look at the gallery. Vivian had turned the color of wet ash. Her perfectly manicured hand was clutching the collar of her suit jacket. She was staring at me with a look of pure, unadulterated terror. The stated purposes for these disbursements were community wellness consulting event, logistical support, and spiritual retreat management, I stated, turning back to the judge. However, the funds were not paid to legitimate community organizations. They were paid directly to Zenith Logistics Apex Strategies and Horizon Holistic Wellness. Those are the exact same fraudulent shell companies registered to Chloe. Mr. Caldwell was frantically flipping through his copy of the binder. His hands were shaking so violently that he tore one of the pages. He was reading the federal tax filings, connecting the routing numbers, and realizing the catastrophic scope of what he had just walked into. But a laundering operation requires a closed loop, Your Honor, I said, my tone relentless and dry. The stolen charity funds did not stay in the stepsister's accounts. She took a flat 10% fee for maintaining the corporate fronts and paying the minimum franchise taxes. The remaining 90% of the capital was systematically wired to a commercial real estate holding group registered in Delaware. I pointed to the final document in the tab. The unredacted federal incorporation documents for that Delaware holding group are on page 60. The registered agent and sole beneficiary of that holding group is the petitioner Terrence. Judge Harrison's face darkened into a mask of pure judicial wrath. He was connecting the dots. He was looking at a multi-million-dollar racketeering enterprise operating right under his nose. They have been running a highly coordinated embezzlement operation for 5 years, I declared, my voice echoing off the marble walls. They siphoned over $3 million from working-class families in their congregation. But 2 months ago, the church required an independent financial audit to secure a commercial construction loan. The matriarch was forced to temporarily freeze the illicit disbursements to ensure the books looked clean for the bank. I turned and looked directly at Terrence. He was completely broken. He was slouched in his chair, staring at the floor, his chest heaving as he hyperventilated. The petitioner's fake businesses were suddenly starved of their stolen cash flow, I said, delivering the final fatal blow. He panicked. He needed liquid capital to maintain his luxury lifestyle and his fraudulent leases until the church audit was completed. So he stole $150,000 from his wife. My hard-earned civilian savings were just a temporary patch to keep his federal crime ring afloat. Your Honor, Mr. Caldwell suddenly shouted. His voice was shrill and completely devoid of its former theatrical arrogance. He practically leaped away from his own table, physically distancing himself from Terrence. Your Honor, I must immediately move to withdraw as counsel for the petitioner. The courtroom descended into absolute chaos. Caldwell was holding his hands up in the air as if his client were radioactive. I was not privy to any of this information, Caldwell stammered, his eyes darting frantically between the judge and the court reporter. I relied entirely on the financial affidavits provided by my client. I cannot represent this individual. I must withdraw my representation on the spot. You will do no such thing, counselor, Judge Harrison roared, slamming his gavel down with a crack like a gunshot. You submitted fabricated ledgers to my court. You moved for an emergency injunction based on a perjured police report. You do not get to walk away because your client just got caught committing federal wire fraud. Sit down and remain silent. Caldwell collapsed into his chair, burying his face in his hands. He knew his career was hanging by a thread. In the gallery, the illusion of the pristine golden family completely shattered. Chloe burst into loud, ugly sobs, completely abandoning her fragile victim persona. She was crying because she knew she was going to federal prison. Vivian gasped loudly. She grabbed her chest, leaning heavily against the wooden pew. The matriarch, who had weaponized her church to destroy my reputation, was now suffocating under the weight of her own sins. She had lost her empire, her social standing, and her freedom in a matter of 20 minutes. Judge Harrison took off his glasses. He looked at the family in the gallery, then at Terrence, and finally at me. The anger in his eyes was replaced by profound, absolute respect. Colonel Judge Harrison, said the title, echoing with heavy significance. I have presided over this court for 20 years. I have rarely seen a case of financial fraud so brazen nor an evidentiary presentation so meticulously executed. You did not just defend against a frivolous lawsuit today. You have single-handedly built an airtight federal indictment. Terrence slowly raised his head. He looked at me, his eyes wide and completely hollow. The realization finally hit him. It hit all of them. They had spent 3 years treating me like a submissive, quiet administrative assistant. They thought I was a naive civilian they could bully, steal from, and discard. They never bothered to learn who I actually was. They had picked a fight with a woman who had spent a decade hunting down corrupt military contractors. They had tried to trap a decorated military prosecutor who built federal racketeering cases for a living. They thought they had cornered a helpless victim, but they had actually locked themselves inside a cage with an apex predator. The prosecution rests, Your Honor, I said softly, sitting back down at my table and closing my briefcase. I did not need to say another word. The slaughter was complete. Judge Harrison did not hesitate. He struck his gavel with a finality that echoed through the room like a steel vault door slamming shut. He dismissed Terrence's frivolous lawsuit and the emergency injunction with prejudice, meaning they could never be filed again. He then ordered the bailiff to take my 3 evidentiary binders directly to his chambers. Looking down from the bench, he stated on the judicial record that he was personally referring the entire matter to the United States Attorney's Office, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. The federal government does not move at the sluggish pace of local family courts. When they have a fully documented ironclad financial matrix handed to them on a silver platter, they move with devastating, overwhelming force. Exactly 19 days after that court hearing, the hammer fell. At 6 o'clock in the morning, a fleet of black tactical SUVs bypassed the manicured hedges and rolled straight up the circular driveway of Vivian's fortified Buckhead estate. I was not there to witness it in person, but the local news helicopters certainly were. Federal agents in tactical gear executed a coordinated search and seizure warrant. Terrence and Chloe were led out of the mansion in handcuffs, their faces broadcast across every morning news channel in Atlanta. The Department of Justice did not offer them a quiet surrender. A federal grand jury indicted both of them on 34 counts of wire fraud conspiracy to commit money laundering and perjury. Chloe caught additional federal charges for filing a false police report to manipulate a judicial proceeding. The millions of dollars Terrence had funneled into his Delaware holding company were immediately seized by federal authorities. Chloe's network of fake wellness startups was dismantled and liquidated before the sun went down. Because of the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, the federal magistrate deemed them both extreme flight risks. They were denied bail. Terrence's custom suits and luxury SUVs were replaced by a standard-issue jumpsuit and a concrete cell in federal holding. But the most spectacular destruction belonged to Vivian. Her pristine, carefully curated reputation disintegrated into absolute ash. When federal agents arrived at Greater Fellowship Tabernacle to seize the administrative ledgers and computer servers, the church leadership went into immediate self-preservation mode. To protect their tax-exempt status and distance the congregation from a massive federal racketeering scandal, the executive board convened an emergency session that same night. By Sunday morning, Vivian was not sitting in her usual seat of honor. She was not allowed anywhere near the building. The senior pastor stood at the pulpit and read a prepared legal statement to the 10,000-member congregation. He publicly announced Vivian's immediate termination from the Board of Trustees, the Women's Ministry, and the Charitable Disbursement Committee. She was entirely excommunicated from the very community she had so ruthlessly weaponized against me just weeks prior. The financial ruin followed the social ruin with terrifying speed. The IRS placed federal tax liens on every single asset attached to Vivian's name, citing her direct complicity in the embezzlement scheme and her authorized signatures on the fraudulent vendor payouts. Every bank account she controlled was frozen. The sprawling red brick estate in Buckhead, the absolute epicenter of her social dominance, was seized by the federal government under asset forfeiture laws pending the criminal trial. Vivian was given 48 hours to vacate the premises. She walked out of her fortress carrying nothing but 2 suitcases. The affluent social circle she had meticulously cultivated completely abandoned her. The same women who had turned their backs on me in the grocery store aisle now acted as if Vivian carried a highly contagious disease. They deleted her number, blocked her on social media, and pretended they had never been associated with her. Vivian became the ultimate social pariah. The woman who had built her entire identity on public perception was left completely isolated, entirely destitute, and waiting in a cheap motel for her own inevitable federal indictment. I did not attend their arraignment hearings. I did not watch the daily news coverage. I did not need to gloat or revel in their misery. I had simply presented the truth, and the truth had scorched their earth entirely on its own. The finalization of my divorce was a masterclass in sterile bureaucratic efficiency. 6 months after the federal raids, I walked back into family court for the absolute last time. Terrence did not arrive in a custom-tailored suit or an expensive watch. He was escorted into the room by federal marshals wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. He looked broken, hollowed out by the reality of his impending federal sentence. When he sat down at the respondent table, he kept trying to catch my eye. He was searching for a flicker of the accommodating, sympathetic wife he had spent 3 years manipulating. I was looking for a lifeline. I gave him absolutely nothing. I did not glare at him. I did not smile triumphantly. I looked through him as if he were made of glass. The family court judge, having already reviewed the federal indictments and the staggering evidence of systemic financial abuse, wasted no time. I was awarded 100% of my premarital assets. I retained sole ownership of my historic home. I recovered every single dollar that had been illegally transferred, plus a massive, crippling civil judgment for punitive damages. I did not say a word to him as the bailiffs led him away. I did not gloat. I did not send a parting message to Vivian or Chloe. I simply gathered my files, walked out of the courthouse, and let the crushing absolute silence be their final eternal punishment. With the toxic weight of that family permanently severed from my life, I stopped hiding. For years, I had deliberately shrunk myself to fit into their narrow, conditional definition of acceptable womanhood. I had played the role of the quiet, unassuming freelancer because I thought dimming my light would keep the peace. I will never make that mistake again. I completely rebranded my consulting firm. I took down the generic civilian landing page and replaced it with a sleek, uncompromising corporate profile. I proudly published my 12 years of service in the Judge Advocate General Corps. I put my rank of colonel right next to my name. I owned my expertise, my history, and my authority. The response was immediate. The federal contracts tripled, and my firm became one of the most sought-after risk management advisories in the Southeast. But wealth generation was no longer my sole objective. I remembered exactly how terrifying it felt to log into my bank account and see my life savings wiped out. I remembered the women in Vivian's congregation who suffered silently under men, just like Terrence's women who stayed in abusive situations because they believed they lacked the financial leverage to escape. I took the punitive damages awarded from the divorce and leased a commercial office space in downtown Atlanta. I launched a pro bono legal and financial clinic specifically designed for women facing financial abuse. We provide forensic accounting, legal representation, and tactical exit strategies for women whose partners try to use money as a weapon of control. We teach them how to trace hidden accounts, how to secure their assets, and how to fight back. I turned the worst betrayal of my life into a fortress for others. It is a Tuesday morning now. The air in Atlanta is crisp and cool. I am sitting on the wraparound porch of my historic home. The deed is locked in my safe solely in my name. I take a slow sip of my dark roast coffee and watch the sunrise paint the Georgia sky in brilliant shades of gold and violet. The neighborhood is perfectly quiet. There are no surprise visits from a manipulative, controlling mother-in-law. There are no theatrical meltdowns happening on my front lawn. There is only peace. It is not the fragile, anxious peace of a woman walking on eggshells to keep a volatile man happy. It is the deep, unshakable peace of a woman who fought a war to secure her own borders and won unconditionally. We are so often taught that we have to be the backbone for everyone else. Society tells us that our strength is measured by how much disrespect we can endure in the name of family loyalty or love. We are pressured to carry the financial and emotional burdens of men who refuse to carry themselves all while smiling and keeping up appearances. But true strength is not infinite tolerance. True strength is knowing your exact undeniable worth and refusing to accept a single penny less. It is moving in absolute silence while your enemies make noise. It is gathering your resources, holding your cards close to your chest, and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Never shrink yourself to make a small, insecure person feel big. Never apologize for your intelligence, your independence, or your boundaries. And above all else, no matter what room you walk into, never let anyone mistake your grace for weakness. The most profound lesson from this story is the undeniable power of knowing your worth and fiercely protecting your boundaries. Society often pressures us to shrink ourselves and endure disrespect in the name of loyalty, mistaking silent suffering for strength. However, true power lies in refusing to negotiate your value to accommodate someone else's toxic ego. When faced with manipulation or betrayal, you never need to scream or seek messy revenge. Instead, move in absolute silence, gather your facts, and let your calculated actions speak for themselves. Never let anyone mistake your quiet grace for weakness. Hit that like button and subscribe to the channel if you are ready to stop shrinking your potential and start standing firmly in your power.